In 2006, a postal building in California would come under attack.
One guy came in at 9 and started yelling at somebody shooting.
There was 4 of them in rapid succession. Pop, 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 pop!
The assailant, almost unique amongst spree killers.
That is extremely rare. Most women simply aren't that violent.
Jennifer San Marco would dispatch her victims with cold, deadly efficiency.
She didn't miss in shooting anybody.
As the clock ticked, the body count rose.
She literally walked up to them and shot them almost point blank.
And with it the question, why had this petite, middle-aged woman embarked on her ruthless killing spree? Santa Barbara County in California, one of the most desirable regions in the Golden State. Nestled between the city of Santa Barbara and the university campus of Isla Vista is the coastal community of Goleta.
Goleta is a great town, a great place to live.
It's nice. You know, they call Goleta, I guess, means the good land or whatever.
There's a very strong environmental element to the community, preserving open space, preserving the beach, preserving wildlife.
In the Goleta city limits, serious crimes against persons are a fairly rare occurrence. We only had 1 homicide in the last 14 years.
But on one day in 2006, the peace in Goleta would be shattered in a way no one was expecting.
January the 30th was a normal day here in the Bureau.
It was a clear day. It was unusually warm for that time of the year.
For most of Goleta's population, including the sheriff's department, the daylight hours had been relatively uneventful.
Made it through the entire shift, and it was pretty much a routine. About 5 p.m., is the end of our day, went home, did the stuff that I normally do when I get home, is family, dinner.
Deputy Clay Turner was one of a small team of officers scheduled for the evening shift.
Me and a couple of the other guys on the shift had earmarked a local place in town that we were going to grab our meal at. We ordered our meals, and we had just gotten our cups for us to fill ourselves with our drinks from the fountain when the call came out over the radio.
The 30th of January 2006, around 9 p.m., U.S. Postal Facility, Goleta. 911 calls began coming in from workers at the mail processing plant.
Sheriff's Department, how can I help you?
Yeah, there's the person that is shooting everybody.
There's somebody shooting? Copy 5 en route. This is the code 3 for a shooting at the post office.
I knew it was the real deal just by the tone of voice and what was going on. This has got to be righteous. This is not somebody dreaming this thing up. It's not firecrackers.
My coworkers start yelling too, oh my God, somebody call 911. And then, this suspect starts shooting her.
I can't imagine what the people in the restaurant were thinking, but we sprinted out the door and got into our patrol cars and started heading towards the call.
911.
Shots have been fired.
Okay.
We have 1 down for sure.
1 down?
At least.
Law enforcement rushed from all directions towards the large building, where hundreds of staff were employed, aware that many lives were potentially in danger.
I'm responding, but I'm talking on with both cell phones to my ears, like I'm talking to different people, and steering with my knee. I had to get down here as quickly as possible.
How many people did you see get shot?
I saw 1, and then, when I took off, I saw her, shooting somebody else.
What was going through my head was if there was somebody that was on the loose inside that facility, knowing how big it was, my fear was the potential of finding many more people that had been shot and either wounded or killed on the inside.
Officers arriving were confronted by several employees fleeing for their lives.
Everybody started coming out, and they all were primarily running.
They were in absolute panic. They had lost it. There was no stopping them. They just wanted to get as far away on foot from that location as they could, and I mean, they're like running.
They basically came right down their main driveway.
It appeared that someone had begun shooting in the staff car park and then entered the building. But little more was known.
We didn't know if the shooter had left at that point or was still inside.
We were sorting through the crowd to try and find somebody who would know something. We were getting broken information as to what the suspect might be wearing: blue jeans, red shirt, dark hair, maybe a male, maybe female. And this is all within a matter of seconds of us pulling up that we're trying to do all this.
Who and where the shooter was were unknown, but one thing was clear. There were dead and dying postal workers at the scene.
When the deputies arrived, the first thing they did is tend to the people that were down in the parking lot.
We got into what they described as a diamond formation. I believe all of us were armed with AR-15s in addition to our sidearms. As we started transitioning down the sidewalk, the first victim I saw, she's looking right at me, but I knew she was gone.
Got 2 black tags, 2 red tags, and the place is still not secure.
Copy. So far, 2 black and 2 red.
I was in the newsroom, and we monitor the police scanner, and we heard a shots fired call. And it was pretty clear very quickly that it was a large incident, because there's certain phrases that they use regarding whether or not there's a dead body or an injured person. They use red tag and black tag.
In one of the aisles of the parking lot, I saw 2 more victims that were down. So me and the other guys, we breached, we went into the building.
Inside the door, the deputies discovered Postal Supervisor Charlotte Colton, shot in the head but still alive. Ahead of them, a corridor leading to the main warehouse.
You're taught to go to the sounds, the shooting, find the suspect, stop the suspect. Well, there's no shooting. All that's coming forth is the constant machine sound. And you could hear the phone ringing and ringing and ringing.
As news of the attack spread like wildfire among the postal workers, there were rumors about the identity of the killer, centering on an ex-employee.
All the witnesses, well, at least many of them, all had said that they recognized the shooter as being a former employee of the facility named Jennifer San Marco.
44-year-old Jennifer San Marco had worked at the Postal Service for around 6 years before leaving the job 2 years before.
When she first started there, she was fairly normal, about as normal as anybody else was. I talked to her on numerous occasions, because a lot of times when you're working side by side, you talk to people. And she was very, very intelligent.
She was fairly quiet. She worked at a case where she would get a tray of letters, and you know, what you would call pigeonholes, but you'd put them in like this. She was actually fairly attractive. I mean, when she first started, I'm sure some of the guys thought she was, she was a pretty good-looking girl.
She seemed, it was kind of both gregarious and a loner. She, she was one of those people you could, hey, Jennifer, how you doing? She, oh, hey, Robert, how are you? From across the aisle or something like that. And she was friendly, you could approach her, you could talk to her, but there was also a side to her that was kind of a little bit standoffish.
Now, 8 years later, the quiet former employee appeared to have the blood of her colleagues on her hands and was somewhere inside the giant sorting room. In January 2006, former postal employee Jennifer San Marco was on the loose with a gun. inside a giant sorting room in Goleta, California. Rushing to the scene, sheriff's officers followed a trail of bodies from the car park into the postal facility. In the entrance corridor, Deputy Clay Turner and his team discovered the seriously wounded postal supervisor, Charlotte Colton.
My number one goal at that point in time was to get the medical professionals in to cater to the two that were down in the parking lot, the one on the sidewalk just in case maybe I was wrong and she was still alive, and to deal with the still breathing Miss Colton.
Clay confirmed that we had 4 people down. He wanted 4 ambulances, and it was my plan to have 4 deputies to be basically the armed guard to go in with these rescue units, of which I ended up being one of the rescue units because we were down in staffing.
Although dreadfully wounded, Charlotte Colton appeared to be responding to the deputies that guarded her.
It almost seemed to us like her breathing became more calm and relaxed when we talked with her.
While Clay and his team provided cover, the rescue crews deployed.
The paramedic was supposed to check for signs of life. If there was signs of life, no treatment, no nothing, just get that person, put them on the gurney and get the heck out of there. And we did that pretty darn quick.
They were able to extract Miss Colton pretty quickly and transported her to the hospital.
4 casualties have been found in the car park and the entrance corridor. How many more were inside was uncertain. With the vast facility ahead, it was decided to wait for SWAT teams before entering.
They set up at the employee entrance door. At that point, they did not hear any shooting. So they determined it was not an active shooter, and now they pulled back and just contained the area.
They essentially waited for the cavalry to get there.
But just who was Jennifer San Marco, the architect of this chaos and catastrophe? And why had this middle-aged woman embarked on her deadly rampage? 1961, the 6th of December. New York, on the US eastern side, Jennifer San Marco was born. She grew up in the borough of Brooklyn.
We're between Avenue L and Avenue K on Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn, and this is across the street from Huddy Junior High School.
Jennifer sat next to me in a class. We had a lot of fun talking and laughing and not paying attention to class.
Schoolmate Thomas Hogue admits he had a crush on the friendly but quiet teen.
I thought that she was a catch. The cat's meow. To be honest with you, I thought she was attractive, she was nice.
Jennifer was always smartly dressed, very easygoing, quiet, able to laugh at jokes. I was kind of a class clown, so the people around us were always laughing, and she kind of joined in the laughter, but not so much in the dialogue.
There are a lot of gaps in her history. She grew up in Brooklyn. She went to high school there. She graduated in '78 from Edward R. Monroe High School.
Right here, we used to line these stairs and hang around, talk. After school, we would all congregate on the corner over there and then pick the activity. We'd play punch ball, which is a rubber ball, you hit it, and then you run bases like baseball, and touch football, and the stick ball, stuff that's popular street games.
There was never any mention of any family or where she came from or anything like that. It seemed like it was almost kind of something that she didn't want to talk about, to me.
She had a distant family member that lived here in this county, and they were close at one time, back when they were growing up. But after the parents split up, then said that they grew distant over the time.
She was an outsider outside of that classroom experience that I had. I didn't hear her say a word boo to anybody else other than that. Other than, you know, all I saw was passing in the hallway, and she was pretty much alone.
San Marco would eventually head out west to the sunshine of Santa Barbara County, where she would pass through jobs as a corrections officer, a police dispatcher, and a school catering assistant, before taking a position with the US Postal Service. There she would develop a reputation as a fast worker in the unique conditions of the vast Goleta facility.
The building, square footage-wise, is about the size of 4.5 American football fields.
A mail sorting center is all these boxes and parcels and letters are all coming into the central location, and then they're being parceled out. So there are these massive, loud machines.
The machines that sort letters, and they sort it to where when the carrier picks up his mail in the morning, it's all in order for him when he goes to deliver the mail. It's supposed to be. But there's still letters that the machine can't read, or they're too big or something, that people still throw mail by hand. We do that every night still.
The automation is fairly loud. Some people wear hearing protection. There are some operations where we can wear headphones and listen to a radio or a Walkman. There were plenty of times where I would listen to a book on tape just to help the time go by quicker and stuff like that.
Some people thought it was monotonous or whatever, but the postal work was, of all the work I've done in my life, that was the best work that I ever had. And it was a very educated workforce, because Santa Barbara's a nice place to live. It's pretty expensive, but the good benefits and the steady work of the Postal Service there were some brilliant people who worked there.
The young Jennifer San Marco had studied at one of the East Coast's flagship colleges. Now she was a full-time worker on the postal facility's late shift.
She used to come to work at 9 o'clock. A couple times she wasn't real friendly, and other times she was, it was kind of like night and day sometimes.
It soon became clear to her co-workers that all was not well.
At first, she'd be talking to herself in the cases where we threw the mail in. The conversations with her imaginary friend were fine at first. It was like, she'd be sitting there talking and talking and talking, and I'd say, "Hey, Jennifer, how you doing?" And she'd turn and say, "Oh, hey, Robert, how are you?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I'm doing great." But as time kept going on, it kept getting more and more angry, her conversations with her imaginary friend.
Jennifer's behavior was on a downward spiral and was becoming increasingly irrational.
I spoke to her one time when she was coming in, and she actually started yelling at me, and I didn't really talk to her after that.
I remember her coming in sometimes with lipstick on, where instead of putting on like most women do, she just across like war paint.
San Marco's home life also appeared to be unraveling.
She lived in a couple places in Santa Barbara. We talked to one landlord where she lived for about a year and a half, and she remembers having dinner with her. She described her as being really smart and vivacious and beautiful, and she couldn't believe that she was single. And then later on, she bought a condominium. That's where things started getting a little weird.
Jennifer, when she went off the deep end, would start chanting or singing Beatles songs out loud and out in the middle of the condo complex.
She would get into really heated arguments with her neighbor over noise.
San Marco shared a party wall with her neighbor, Beverly Graham.
Beverly Graham had lived in Santa Barbara for a really long time. She was a really sweet lady. She was a phone operator, I think, for the gas or electric company. She was a really pleasant woman.
The loud music led to a call to the sheriff's office.
The deputies went out for a noise complaint. The noise went down, and the deputies cleared the call and went on for the rest of their duties.
But Jennifer San Marco would not forget the incident, and at work, she became increasingly odd.
Got to the point where she wouldn't acknowledge anybody, talk to anybody, whatever, just like ignore everybody, but she still did her work.
After 6 years working at the postal facility, things came to a head when she made a disturbing comment to longtime co-worker Dexter Shannon.
She said to Dexter Shannon something about a woman, a former employee that they knew mutually, who committed suicide. And there was something in that prompted Dexter to go to his supervisor and say, "Hey, I'm concerned about her."
I wasn't working too far away, but you could hear some yelling, and so everybody's kind of looking to see what's going on. She wouldn't go into the office, and they had to call in some law enforcement.
Suddenly, all hell breaks loose. Jennifer goes flying by with the cops in tow.
It was kind of scary. It took two guys to, actually holding her legs and her arms and get handcuffs on her. They had no other choice.
The deputies handcuffed her and waited for a representative from the mental health assessment team. And that team made the determination to commit her for a 72-hour involuntary hold per 5150 of the Welfare and Institutions Code.
I figured I wouldn't ever see her again.
We know that she was examined. We know that ultimately that there was a psychologist that was examining her and that did make a diagnosis to her and that she refused treatment. And part of the problem that she had was a failure to admit that she had a problem.
San Marco clearly had a history of problems that would be the hallmark of a descent into some serious mental health problem. So she was clearly an individual who was suffering psychotic delusions and intrusive thoughts, and her behaviour was becoming more removed from reality.
After her ejection from the Postal Service, San Marco was retired on health grounds. Little did her colleagues know that Jennifer San Marco would one day return with murder in mind. Over a 6-year period working for the U.S. Postal Service in Goleta, California, Jennifer San Marco's odd behavior had escalated to the point that she was forcibly removed from the building and retired on health grounds. It's thought she decided to head back towards her family in the East, but it seems fate had something else in store.
She packs her pickup truck, she drives east, on Route 66, her car essentially breaks down, and that's why she settled it in Milan.
Grand San Milan area is really small, just not a lot really to do in the area unless you go outside, to sightsee.
New Mexico, flat land, not a lot of grass and a lot of trees and shrubbery, a lot of dirt, kind of desolate.
We have the mountains around. Smaller towns like Milan are very remote.
If you want to live somewhere where it's nice and quiet, it's a place to be.
Selling her apartment in Goleta, San Marco decided to buy a property in the desert town. Abel Ortega supplied the fuel for her home.
She was real good looking. She had long hair, and she was really nice. And we always, we'd take her gas and she'd come in the next day or whatever and pay for it. She lived in an A-frame house right behind the office here, and she had a 250-gallon tank, and she was a very good customer.
It was just your standard 2-story, single-family home, standard backyard, but then as the land went out farther, it was kind of desolate and desert type.
San Marco would be a regular visitor to the village administrator's offices, where she would become somewhat fixated with employee Sonia Salazar.
For that first year, she came in, she would just pay her bill. She was pretty normal, just a normal customer. As she would go in, she would ask for me. Or if I wasn't there in the office where she could see me, she would be looking for me because my coworker would say, she asked for you, and if I wasn't there, she would just look for me, and then they would help her the best they could, and then she would leave.
But after around 12 months, Jennifer San Marco began to noticeably change.
Probably after a year, she came in with a short, spiky haircut.
It looked as though she had taken scissors to her hair. It was not a haircut. It was obviously something she had done to herself.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Just fine.
I can help you here.
And her dress was completely different. She looked like a different person. But through that year, she wasn't as nice to me anymore. And if I wasn't there, she wouldn't even let them help her. She would just leave.
She'd go up to the cash register and she says, I came to pay my bill. And So I'd look it up and, you know, and I say, well, you don't know nothing. And she'd look to her right and she'd say, see, I told you that I didn't owe a bill, that I had already paid it. And she'd have a little discussion there, you know, with her imaginary friend. And then she'd look like that and she said, okay, well, thank you very much, she says, and then she'd leave, you know.
She would go to grocery stores and she would buy stuff, and that she would just, when she would leave, she'd go out and throw it in the trash, including the money. And that was, and the same, she would buy liquor at other stores and just throw it in the trash.
San Marco entered the village offices, wishing to apply to publish a series of documents she'd written.
I was sitting at my desk and she sat across from me, and that's when, you know, I noticed that there was something wrong. She was arguing and using foul language, but not towards me. So she would ask me a question, and as I was answering her question, she was then arguing with someone that was not there, in other words. Jennifer had wanted to apply for a business license, which was actually a business that she would name the Racist Press.
The title of the publications struck a chord with her former Brooklyn schoolmate, Thomas Hogue.
So this was largely an Italian neighborhood at the time, totally changed now. But in the 70s, this is largely Italian, and most of the people that I were hanging out with were Italian.
They started the phenomenon of busing, where young children of color were brought from other neighborhoods into our neighborhood.
The thought was to alleviate crowding in the slums, so to speak.
And that caused a little racial strife. So there was it was a kind of turbulent a little bit. There was some free flowing use of the N-word, and it was a new thing for people in the neighborhoods to experience, so it was a bit uncomfortable.
The only thing that I saw that was of interest to note is that she was part of that whole crew where people were threatened in the neighborhoods by change, and the busing in of people from different neighborhoods, different color.
But despite its inflammatory title, San Marco's Racist Press was far from a bigoted tirade.
I pledged my life to defend the premise of democracy in this country, and could not in good conscience pay for or justify a politically motivated racist murder. Not one or 1,000.
There were 5 volumes of the Racist Press. In reading them, I was expecting to see something more overt. I thought that she would come out and start making disparaging remarks against anybody of color or any type of religious backgrounds. A lot of it was just hard to understand.
The documents alluded to an elaborate conspiracy theory.
The United States government functions as a white supremacist affiliate, embracing Nazi German dogma.
She thought that the government was somehow controlling people, in cahoots with the KKK. She made a link to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and that all of those things were sending messages to people to commit murders.
A government conspiracy, psychics, and the Rocky Horror Picture Show? It sounds absurd for a sophisticated nation using this format as a legitimate, plausible strategy.
As 2005 continued, San Marco's neighbors in New Mexico noticed her going downhill rapidly.
I did know of the time that she had stripped at a local gas station.
Right back here at the edge of the building over here, she would get on her knees and start like praying, you know, and she'd be, you know, with her hands up like this and that, and start praying, and, you know, found it kind of weird.
We clearly know that when individuals have got severe mental health problems, having a significant other there to share your worries, to get advice from, to talk about your symptoms, is clearly much more beneficial than individuals who are on their own. we see individuals who are isolated go down this descent spiral very quickly.
However, there may have been another element playing on San Marco's mind. July 1976. New York City. Serial killer, the son of Sam, begins a campaign of violence on the streets of the metropolis.
In the past year, a psychopathic gunman has killed 6 people and wounded 8 others in New York City. He calls himself Son of Sam.
You know, she grew up there, she was aware of this, she mentions it in her writing.
Over a 12-month period, postal worker David Berkowitz had preyed on young New Yorkers, shooting them with a handgun and spreading panic throughout the city.
You had this guy going around randomly killing people, and they had no idea what this was about. And I think if you were a young person, a teenager, particularly a girl, it would have been terrorizing.
And it appeared San Marco, a petite young woman of Italian descent with long dark hair, fitted exactly what New Yorkers believed to be the son of Sam's preferred target.
People were very nervous, apprehensive. Girls cut their hair, changed the color. Streets were empty. Everybody was just terrified. Had no idea what was going to pop up next.
For journalist Scott, there are too many parallels in the two tales to ignore.
David Berkowitz was a postal employee who believed that a dog was giving him messages to kill people. Jennifer San Marco was a postal employee. She apparently talked to animals. She thought birds were giving her messages.
The notorious 70s killer also featured in San Marco's writings.
Fact. The post office employed David Berkowitz in the 1970s during his infamous reign of terror as what the media dubbed the Son of Sam killings. Was David Berkowitz a psychotic or psychic killer?
The son of Sam would go on to shoot 6 victims dead and injure more, before being captured in 1977, when Jennifer San Marco was 16. 28 years later, in 2005, San Marco would take the parallels one stage further, when she bought a handgun of her own.
The semi-automatic handgun that she had purchased from a pawn shop in New Mexico, and waited a 15-day waiting period, and went and picked it up. And at that point, also bought 200 rounds of reloaded 9mm ammunition.
Both these actions, again, are perfectly rational and cogent, so she clearly had periods where she was able to be in touch with reality and certainly knew what she was planning on doing far in advance.
In the backyard, there was a lot of some target practice. Like, you can tell that she or somebody had been out there shooting a gun, practicing on shooting targets. Not knowing how far and how far she was from the target, you could tell that whoever was shooting was a good shot.
And San Marco was about to use her skills to deadly effect. In 2003, after displaying bizarre behavior, postal worker Jennifer San Marco had been forcibly removed from the Goleta sorting facility where she worked and retired on health grounds. She had resettled in New Mexico, where her behavior had become increasingly strange. Now the 44-year-old was about to bring vengeance down upon her former workplace. At the end of January 2006, Jennifer San Marco got in her truck and headed back to California. Sometime just before the start of the 9 p.m. shift change, Jennifer San Marco arrived at the Goleta postal facility.
She drove all the way here from New Mexico in one trip. Knew when shift change was going to be, timed her arrival at the gate.
In order to get through the first security system, San Marco tailgated another vehicle and entered the staff car park.
She parked her truck, backed into the stall, about 100 feet from the employee entrance door.
But still, you need a badge to get in the front door.
San Marco held up an employee at gunpoint and demanded he hand over his pass, which would provide electronic access to the secure staff entrance.
And then she told him, okay, now get out of here. And, of course, he took off.
Although she had spared one employee, it wouldn't last. In the car park, San Marco encountered 37-year-old Z. Fairchild and shot her in the head.
She didn't miss. It's pretty steely on her part to be able to do that.
San Marco was seen approaching the staff entrance before turning towards 28-year-old Malika Higgins and shooting her.
She literally walked up to them and shot them almost point blank.
Just outside the employee entrance, San Marco encountered and shot 42-year-old Nicola Grant.
When the shooting was occurring out in the parking lot, there was a couple employees that were in a break room, which was adjacent to the parking lot. And they heard what sounded like gunfire. And they looked out the window. They didn't see her shooting anybody at that point. But she said that she looked at them and smiled.
Jennifer San Marco then entered the building, where around 80 people were working.
It was somewhere near 9 o'clock when I heard the first loud report, and it was very loud. When you have as much automation as we have running and the other machines and that going on, it's very loud in there. But this thing was loud.
I had heard some noises, and I thought, we have these things that sometimes a mail comes in on, they're called a pallet.
If you stand them up straight up and then you let it fall, when it hits the ground, it makes a very loud report. So a lot of us thought it was just a pallet dropping. So I expected when I looked up, one of my mail handling friends would be there saying, boy, you really get into your work or something like that. What I saw was one of my coworkers grab a female employee, throw her to the side, point to the door, and yell, run.
The one guy came in at 9 and started yelling at somebody shooting. You kind of think, oh, yeah.
Despite workers' disbelief, the situation was very real. San Marco had made her way deeper into the complex. There she would shoot 44-year-old supervisor Charlotte Colton.
She was a beautiful woman physically, but that beauty went way more, it wasn't just skin deep or whatever. She was a bright light in this town that was snuffed out.
One of Charlotte's colleagues dragged her into the entrance corridor, where Deputy Clay Turner later discovered her. But Jennifer San Marco was not finished.
The first shot, there was a pause of about 3 or 4 seconds. Then I heard 2 more shots, pop, pop.
She made her way towards her old workstation.
52-year-old Lupe Schwartz must have seen San Marco coming, but she couldn't save herself.
And there was a pause of about 1 or 2 more seconds, and there was 4 of them in rapid succession. Pop, 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 pop! And that was when I caught some movement in the peripheral vision to my left side, and I heard somebody yell, go, go, go.
Grandfather Dexter Shannon was wearing headphones. He never heard San Marco coming and was shot dead at point-blank range.
Dexter had a bunch of kids and grandkids, but he had served in the Air Force and had been in Vietnam himself.
Oh, he was a very nice man. I never heard Dexter say an unkind word about anyone.
After shooting 6 of her former co-workers, Jennifer San Marco used her handgun to take her own life.
She was laying on the floor in a prone position, and she still clutched the weapon in her hand. So we had to pry her fingers away from the trigger and away from the grip of the gun to get it out of her hand. It was still loaded and cocked and ready to be fired.
Most spree killers want to commit suicide. They believe that this life is not worth living. They're so miserable and they don't see a way out. But first they want to get even with everyone responsible for those miseries. So that's why they engage in a killing spree first, and many of them are suicidal.
For all those involved, the enormity of what had happened began to sink in.
Like it wasn't even real, until I saw somebody who was actually, laying dead on the sidewalk. I knew that it was real.
4 had died at the scene. 2, including Charlotte Colton, who deputies had desperately tried to comfort, died in hospital.
Deputies were reassuring her and talking to her the entire time.
I just wish we could have gotten there sooner. Because all of us want to prevent destruction and prevent anyone having to feel that kind of pain of losing a loved one.
But this shocking tale was not yet over.
I had just arrived home, and I was laying down, and when my phone went off again, and it was my lieutenant telling me that we had another homicide.
The victim was San Marco's former neighbor, Beverly Graham, who hadn't been seen since the previous day.
Hi, my girlfriend's dead. Please send somebody right away.
We had a homicide reported, and we staged in this area, getting ready to make entry into the apartment.
Miss Graham's boyfriend was the one who discovered the decedent, Miss Graham.
It became clear that before Jennifer San Marco had made her assault on the postal facility, she had decided to settle a score with the neighbor who had complained about her loud music.
The wall you see is the area where San Marco had access to the rear of the apartment. There was hair pulled from somebody's head that was scattered across the coffee table and around the apartment, and there were things that were kind of in disarray.
Jennifer San Marco's deadly spree had cost the lives of 7 innocent people. But the question remained, why?
For San Marco, a woman whose life had been disintegrating slowly around her, I think this was her last roll of the dice. I think the realization that she'd hit rock bottom was perhaps the trigger point that then allowed her to listen to her paranoid beliefs and conspiracy theories.
Most women simply aren't that violent. Her killing spree must have come from a profound belief that her job meant a tremendous amount to her.
There was nothing any of these people did. I mean, even when you look through these weird slights that she was documenting, there was nothing any of these people did that caused them to be targeted in some way.
Whatever her perceived motivations, Jennifer San Marco's ruthless killing spree had devastated countless lives and changed a community forever.
Every time I come to this intersection, very rarely do I not think about that night.
In the days and weeks that unfolded, we got to see and hear more about the victims and their families, and
this by far was the dark part of my career.
There isn't a day that's gone by that I haven't thought about what happened that night, or who we lost, or the friendships that we shared, or anything.
Yeah, I think about it quite often when I walk in the front door. You know, it was a pretty big deal.
In 2011, 22-year-old Jared Loughner would embark on a swift and brutal rampage that would make world headlines.
Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was among those shot.
Men.
All of a sudden I heard a bang.
Women.
There was multiple people shot.
And children.
Oh my God.
Would die at his hand. As the seconds ticked, the body count rose.
It was just an eerie scene of people dead, taking their last breaths.
And with it the question, what had driven this youth from the Arizona suburbs to commit his deadly killing spree?
This is my genocide school.
January 2011, Tucson, Arizona. A thriving city set amidst an arid landscape in the southwestern corner of the United States. In a downtown shopping mall, recently re-elected Senator Gabrielle Giffords was about to begin a session of Congress on Your Corner, an opportunity for a meet and greet with the local residents.
Gabby is my congresswoman, and she liked to make herself available to her constituents. People didn't have to come to her office. She would announce where she was going to be and invite people to come and talk with her.
Many had been looking forward to the morning, and with an air of anticipation, a crowd gathered for the 10 a.m. start.
It was a beautiful, crisp, clear, bright blue sky Saturday morning.
And we went out to the Safeway just to pick up a couple of small items.
I pulled into the parking lot and I could see the big sign up there that said Gabby Giffords.
Everybody seemed to be pleasant, enjoying talking to each other. I was enjoying eavesdropping.
Spirits were high, but unknown to those gathered, a danger lurked amongst them.
There were 12 chairs sitting in front, with 12 people, mostly couples, sitting in those chairs. So I walked to the end of the 12 chairs.
But just moments in, and the lives of those waiting in line were suddenly torn apart.
Within seconds of us walking into the store, that the pops started.
I was standing there talking to this couple, and all of a sudden I heard a bang.
And then a series of pop, 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 pop.
Bang, 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 just like that.
People started running into the Safeway, bloodied, screaming. They've shot the Congresswoman, they've shot the Congresswoman.
I could see the shadow of the gunman walking down the sidewalk.
And at point blank range, he was shooting everybody in the head.
Pop, 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 pop.
And when I dropped to the sidewalk, I felt the bullet hit the back of my head.
911, where's your emergency? 911, there was a shooting at Safeway where Gabrielle Giffords was. Was somebody shot then, sir? Yes, the guy, it looked like the guy had a semi-automatic pistol. He went in, he just started firing. Is anybody injured? Did you say Gabrielle Giffords was hit? She's hit. Okay. She's breathing. Okay, and there's other people that are injured? Other people, there's multiple people shot. Okay. Oh my God.
20584. The call came out and we heard the audible tones saying that there was a serious incident that was going on. And what I was told next was there was a shooting at the Safeway.
A caller is reporting a shooting him out with a semi-automatic weapon. He shot at people, and he was last seen headed towards the Walgreens. He ran northbound out of the store wearing a black hoodie and blue jeans. And we have a caller who believes that Gabrielle Giffords was shot. That's multiple victims.
There was lights and sirens the entire way.
In just 17 seconds, the shopping mall had been transformed into a scene of bloody carnage.
I couldn't accept, even then, even as I'm walking out, that there was actually somebody out there shooting.
In the immediate aftermath, the ruthless spree became a global news story.
We continue our team coverage on the mass shooting at a North Side Safeway. Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was among those shot.
The gunman had injured 13 people and brutally murdered 6.
Oh my God, there are dead people outside that door, right in your grocery store.
And the world waited to hear who was responsible for the unprecedented and ferocious rampage.
We will have some more information on the person in custody connected to these shootings. The Associated Press has identified the person, the suspected shooter, as 22-year-old Jared Loughner.
But what had driven the young man from a peaceful Tucson suburb to turn his gun on his fellow residents and commit such a frenzied killing spree? 10:10 a.m., Saturday the 8th of January, 2011. Tucson, Arizona has just been rocked by the actions of one young man, 22-year-old Jared Lee Loughner.
All of a sudden I heard a bang.
They've shot the Congresswoman. They've shot the Congresswoman.
In a killing spree lasting just 17 seconds, Loughner had managed to end the lives of 6 people and wounded 13 more, including the critical shooting of Gabrielle Giffords. The Congresswoman appeared to have been his main target. Known to be one of the oldest cities in the United States, Tucson, Arizona is located just 60 miles from the Mexico border.
The culture is very influenced by the Mexican population, so we have a lot of the Hispanic culture here. You'll have a lot of great Mexican food. You'll see a lot of the Spanish dancing and in the music.
It's beautiful, it's sunny. People have no idea when they hear about Tucson, Arizona, and think that it's just a big desert wasteland, and they come here and see the beautiful mountains and our fabulous weather.
Despite its recent growth, the city is still renowned as a friendly, welcoming place.
And we have a very small town feel, even though there's probably about 800,000 people that live in the community.
Definitely just a nice, chill place. Great place to raise a family. I loved that growing up just because I felt safe.
One young resident's early years in Tucson began no differently to anyone else. Born on the 10th of September 1988, Jared Lee Loughner was raised an only child in a working-class area of the city. His mother was a respected and well-liked manager for the Parks and Recreation Department of Pima County, and his father stayed at home, restoring cars for money.
Growing up in Tucson, it's nice just because it's very quiet. You get to the suburbs and it's just a nice, calm place. People, they're still friendly though. There's always something to do. There's never a boring time.
During his early years, Loughner enjoyed a close-knit circle of friends.
I met Jared through a mutual friend. We were in middle school, we were about like 12, 13 at the time, and the common bond we had was music. At that time, I had just learned how to play the guitar, so I was just like, I need to start a band, I need to go do something, and a mutual friend was just like, hey, yeah, Jared, he plays bass, like, go talk to Jared.
The first time I met Jared, I believe it was at a party, and because we kind of all had the same friends.
Although he demonstrated a rebellious streak in his early teenage years, Loughner was far from a concern to either his parents or those around him.
I think we were with Jared. We were in my neighborhood and we're going up and down the streets and we're getting out and smashing all the mailboxes on the street. Pretty much just get into a lot of trouble. Drink, go, wreak havoc on neighborhoods, kind of stuff like that.
Despite some episodes of delinquency, his friends didn't consider him unusual amongst his peers.
He was on the same page as everyone else. His conversations, everything he was doing seemed absolutely normal.
But as Jared Loughner reached his late teens, the friendly, relaxed musician that everyone liked began to change for the worse.
It seems that a big turning point in his life was he had a crush on a classmate in high school. According to the gal, he had a much bigger crush on her than she ever had on him. So she just gave him the door, you know, they broke up, and according to his high school male peers, that was when the guy just really kind of began to lose it.
I think he just really wanted to have friends and a girlfriend and stuff like that, and I think that never worked out for him, so I think he felt kind of alone.
He started acting out in a way that, in retrospect, looks like the early part of an onset of mental illness. He withdrew from school, he withdrew from friends.
As an increasingly isolated teenager, Loughner eventually dropped out of high school in 2006. His slow retreat into a private world went relatively unnoticed. But 5 years later, he would grab the nation's attention with a vengeance. 29 minutes past midnight, the 8th of January 2011, Motel 6, Tucson. 10 hours before embarking on his killing spree, Jared Loughner checked into room 411. Throughout the night, Loughner carried out a series of movements that saw him putting into place the final preparations for an assassination attempt on Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords.
Before the spree, Loughner was clearly very busy. He was no doubt suffering from what we would often call future foreshortening. He wasn't looking much beyond the next 24 hours. In fact, he may not have believed he would survive the next 24 hours.
As the night progressed, Loughner made several short trips to a local convenience store. At 1 a.m., he picked up a roll of newly developed film containing photos he'd taken of himself only hours earlier.
There were several pictures of Jared Loughner, one of him in female underwear. It was kind of odd. And there was a photograph of a 9mm gun on top of a U.S. textbook.
Loughner made the final return to his room at 4:12 a.m. with his newly developed photographs. He logged on and entered into his familiar subversive world within the internet and began posting the bizarre images online.
He spent into the wee hours on the computer, sending emails out and, goodbye, dear friends, stuff like that.
Retreating into the online world was nothing new. In recent months, Loughner had been pushing away friends and family in the real world in favor of a community online, where he hoped his increasingly irrational views would find a home.
A lot of his MySpace records showed that he was into revolutionary literature such as Fahrenheit 351 as well as Mein Kampf, though he was well read in a typical standard teenage way.
One particular site was a gathering place for conspiracy theorists and skeptics, and here Loughner hoped his odd views would find recognition.
He would often post long rambling comments, often about currency, about the Constitution of America, how high schools were an illegal act, and how gold and silver were the only true currency to believe in.
Loughner's views began falling on deaf ears, some onliners even going so far as to suggest he seeks psychological help.
A lot of his fellow students and professors became really spooked, very freaked out by the guy's very, very bizarre behavior.
He seemed kind of irrational, very irritated, almost demanding certain things, just not calm anymore, almost, just the total opposite.
He was changing big time. He had a very, very bizarre temper, and I think he was starting to do drugs with the guys he was hanging out with at that time.
He didn't really seem, always to be like happy-go-lucky or anything. He seemed like he kind of had like a dark side to him, or maybe a sadness.
While he was at Pima Community College, there were a couple of instances when issues as difficult to talk about as abortion or war would come up. And at the most unideal times, he would blurt out in laughter.
One of his female classmates was talking about her very, very traumatic experience having an abortion. And Loughner came up with this remark like, "Oh my God, you're a baby killer."
And of course, people in the classroom would take exception to that and then would ask him what his problem was. What are you doing? Are you trying to make a mockery of what we're saying? And he would just always respond in kind by laughing and just saying, "You're all idiots, you're all illiterate. You don't know anything that's going on here."
Some of the students were very, very spooked by his behavior. In fact, one of the gals who was in her 50s and she had been a mental health technician, she took a seat by the door and she emailed one of her friends saying, "I just have a strong guts feeling that someday this guy's going to come into class with a gun and start shooting, and I just want you to know I'll be the first one out the door."
We're examining the torture of students.
The final straw for college authorities came when Loughner posted a disturbing video online.
This is my genocide school, where I'm going to be homeless because of the school.
The Pima Community College police discovered a video he had made.
He took a handheld camera and he walked around the campus of Pima Community College, and he basically talked about it being the biggest waste of money in American education.
This is Pima Community College, one of the biggest scams in America.
We're like, this is from Jared? Like, what? Like, this is creepy. It's just, it did not seem like anything, it didn't seem like any of his interests that he was previously aligned with.
Here's the best part, the bookstore, the bookstore, the bookstore, the bookstore. It is so illegal to sell this book under the Constitution. We are also censored by our freedom of speech.
It was a rambling, psychotic video that set off alarm bells in the Pima Community College Police Department.
If the student is unable to locate the external universe, then the student is unable to locate the internal universe. Where is all my subjects? I could say something sound right now, but I don't feel like it.
Finally, the authorities at Pima College had a meeting with Loughner and his parents and said, enough is enough. We're kicking you out of college.
They gave him a letter. They said that he was suspended from school and that he could not come back until he had a mental health evaluation and an okay from a mental health professional, a psychologist or a psychiatrist.
He was never able to produce that letter, of course.
Thank you. This is Jared from Pima College.
7:04 a.m., the 8th of January, 2011. Just 3 hours before Loughner embarked on his killing spree, he again left his motel room and made yet another trip to a store. This time he tried to buy ammunition for a recently purchased handgun.
He had attempted to purchase 9mm ammunition. However, his behavior was so erratic that the sales clerk denied him. Actually told him, I'll go check the back to see if I can find any extra ammunition.
The clerk was, hey, something wrong with this guy.
Came back and lied to Jared Loughner, telling him he had no ammunition to sell.
The gun Loughner was trying to buy ammunition for was a high-capacity semi-automatic, legally purchased by himself only a few weeks earlier.
He also developed an interest in firearms, which isn't that unusual, but did concern some of his friends when he showed up with a gun here or there. Some friends had some concerns about him owning a gun.
At 7:31 a.m., undeterred, Loughner again attempted to purchase ammunition from a different store. This time, failing to raise any suspicions, he succeeded in buying 8 boxes containing a total of 400 rounds.
He already had his weaponry. He had the Glock semi-automatic with several magazines, which nobody needs, you know, unless you're in military combat.
With only hours to go before the arrival of his main target, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, Loughner was on the move once again. This time he was making his way home. As Loughner approached the front door of his house, he was confronted by his father.
His father said, "What the hell are you doing here with this big bag there? Where are you going?"
In recent months, the relationship between Loughner and his parents had become increasingly strained.
His parents had actually disabled his vehicle and at one point taken away his shotgun just because they feared that Jared might be doing something or might consider doing something that wouldn't be safe for him or anyone else.
Both Randy and Amy Loughner were clearly concerned about their son's behavior. They tried to talk to him, and they just couldn't make any headway.
But that, too, speaks volumes. It speaks to his parents being concerned just about Jared's state of mind. They had no idea what he was about to embark upon, but they knew that their son was battling something, and he was certainly confused, to say the very least.
Outside the front of the home, a standoff between father and son continued.
But his dad was evidently very spooked to the point where he prohibited him to go back and use the car.
Grabbing a black bag from the boot of the car, Loughner turned and fled from his home.
The guy ran several blocks away, calls for a cab on his cell, so a cab comes down to pick him up.
At around 10:10 a.m. on Saturday, the 8th of January, 2011, one of America's oldest cities was devastated by a brutal killing spree carried out by 22-year-old Jared Lee Loughner. Just 1 hour earlier, Tucson, Arizona, and the sun-drenched morning appeared to be as any other for the local residents.
It was a beautiful Saturday morning, early January. It's a time of year that people who live in southern Arizona cherish because it's usually 70 degrees or so. It's sunny. It's a beautiful day to be outside.
It was an absolutely normal day for me. It was a relaxed Saturday. I didn't have to work. I was going to do some grocery shopping, go visit my mother.
Sunny, warm, just a glorious day, and my husband and I went out on a walk.
I had woken up fairly early that day, was just, cleaning, doing various things, and I had gone to the gym.
January 8th was a day off for me. It was a Saturday, and I was at home with my family and enjoying the time that I had to be with my wife and my daughters.
For these residents, their lives were about to become unintentionally entwined with the arrival of Senator Gabrielle Giffords.
What was supposed to be happening at the Safeway that day was what's called a Congress on Your Corner, and it's a program that Congresswoman Giffords had installed in which she would meet on occasion with her constituents. There were telephone calls made out to the constituents the previous day, informing them of the event, and it was just an opportunity for her to interact with the people of Tucson and get a feel for what some of the items or some of the political issues they had on their mind.
I got a robocall from Gabby Giffords saying that she was going to have a Congress on Your Corner event Saturday, January 8th, and I went to thank her for her hard work that she does for us.
Unbeknownst to Gabrielle Giffords and her team, what was supposed to be a very low-key, relaxed gathering had in fact a very real and present threat attached. Jared Lee Loughner had a burning hatred for the Congresswoman that could be traced back to an incident years previously.
Loughner had actually met Gabrielle Giffords at a rally similar to the one where he committed his spree.
He had actually been to a prior talk that our Congresswoman gave, and he raised his hand, he had a question.
And he basically asked, quote, "What is government if words don't have meaning?" Congressman Giffords obviously didn't really know how to answer that question because it's sort of without any context, how would you answer that?
This was something he used to always say, words have no meaning. And she was kind of like, nonplussed by that, said, well, thank you, and let's move on to the next question.
He took that slight very personally, and it's something that grew in him over the months and years that followed. And it became not only a curiosity, but it became a very directed hatred toward Congresswoman Gabby Giffords.
A later exchange would compound the hatred he felt towards her.
He also wrote to her office, and her office wrote back to him, but they made the mistake of addressing the letter to a Mr. Loughner rather than Loughner, and this angered him and proved that he was clearly intellectually superior to the people who were in power. So he had no respect for politicians, state, teachers, or authority.
This kind of killing spree is not political. It comes out of psychopathology, not politics. And Jared Loughner would have opened fire under these circumstances, even if he had never met Congressman Giffords.
At 9:54 a.m., Loughner arrived by taxi outside the Safeway store.
Lots of small behavioural clues from Loughner's behaviour before the spree show that he was completely lucid and coherent. He took a taxi to the supermarket where Giffords was speaking. He had the money on him to pay. He gave a bill to the taxi driver and insisted on the change, so he clearly knew what he was doing and where he was.
Just yards away, Loughner's intended target was about to greet those who had been queuing to meet her.
When I went down there that day, I pulled into the parking lot and I could see the big sign up there that said Gabby Giffords. And so I parked the car and walked up there.
Now there was probably 25 people in line. There was a number of elderly women and men. Appeared to be couples, some not. There was a woman just slightly older than me with a little girl with her.
And when I got about 6 feet from Gabby, one of her aides, Gabe Zimmerman, who I'd never met before, came out and talked to me and told me I'd have to get to the end of the line and sign in.
Gabrielle Giffords is there just about ready to start her Congress on the corner. And I turned to my husband, I said, you're lucky that I'm not more political, or I would make you stop right now while I shake her hand. And he's like, come on, let's get inside and get the Brussels sprouts and the milk and get out of here before it gets too crowded. So we are walking in. The shooter is walking out at the exact same time.
All of a sudden, this crazed guy comes barging his way through this line, way up to the front, takes out this pistol, and bang!
He opened fire, shooting Gabrielle Giffords directly in the head.
Gabe Zimmerman, who was one of Gabrielle Giffords' leading aides, he immediately ran up to her aide, and he took a bullet in his head, which immediately killed him.
Within seconds of us walking into the store, that the pop started.
I knew immediately it was a gun.
I was standing there talking to this couple, and all of a sudden I heard a bang.
I had no idea what that was. I'd never heard a gun fire before. And it wasn't until people started running into the Safeway, screaming, they've shot the Congresswoman, they've shot the Congresswoman, that my brain woke up and went, oh my gosh.
I saw him just as a figure walking, as a shadow.
Turning to his left, facing the queuing line of now shocked attendees, he rapidly opened fire again.
He pulled the gun up and he aimed it right at my head, and then he brought this hand up to grab the gun.
If I ran to the north or ran to the west, I might make myself a target. So I laid down on the sidewalk, hoping that he would not notice me.
When he brought this hand up to grab the gun, I dropped to the sidewalk. And when I dropped to the sidewalk, I felt the bullet hit the back of my head. And I went right on down and laid on the sidewalk.
As the frenzied attack continued, Loughner turned his gun on the then district director, Ron Barber. Another attendee, Judge John Roll, leapt in between the two in a moment of sheer bravery.
John Roll pushed him under the table, jumped on top of him, and took a fatal wound in the back.
I walked out, and the first body that I came to was Judge John Roll. I couldn't tell where he was shot. And I kept asking, there were a few people crawling around, where is he shot? Where is he shot? I just started doing CPR. It was futile. I mean, he was just gone. He saved Ron Barber's life, but lost his.
After emptying his first magazine, Loughner attempted to reload his gun to continue his spree. In the seconds that followed, a bystander seized the opportunity and picked up the nearest chair, hitting Loughner across the back.
And when this person tried to hit him with the folding chair, his left arm flew out, and that gave me a chance to grab his wrist. And I grabbed his left wrist just like this and stuck my foot in front of his feet and hit him just as hard as I could with my right hand.
During the struggle that followed, Loughner fell to the ground.
I hear, get the gun, get the magazine, and I knelt up, and as I knelt up, I'm right at the small of the back of the shooter.
I took my hand and I grabbed that I had his left wrist with, and I slid it right up to his throat like that.
Loughner again attempted to grab another fully loaded magazine out of his back pocket.
And in his haste, he dropped the magazine, and I was able to grab it before he could pick it up.
And I told him if he moved, I'd choke him. And he went to roll a little, and I choked him. And he went, ow, 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 ow.
In the heat of the moment, with Loughner subdued, one of the victims grabbed his gun.
Another man actually took Loughner's gun and pointed it at him and threatened to shoot him.
And Bill Badger said, put the gun down and step on it. Right now, put it on the ground and step on it. And so he did.
With Loughner unable to escape, police raced to the scene.
Requesting additional units. Shall I ask the other frequencies?
There are multiple victims. We need a lot more units here.
And fire is sending everything they have.
As I was heading there, the dispatchers were giving us more information. When the initial call came out and I heard those audible tones, the only information I was given was that there was a shooting, and as I was responding was when the updated information was given.
Customers have tackled the suspect. They are holding him down at the Safeway.
With the gunman restrained, he was soon in police custody, and news of his identity began to filter out.
One of my close girlfriends, she calls me, and I answer, and at this time, I'm like, where are you? What's going on? She's like, I'm at Safeway. And I'm like, okay, well, are you all right? She's like, I don't know what happened. She's like, but it was weird. She's like, I saw this young kid, and he looked familiar, and he had a gun, just point blank shooting people.
I remember getting out of the gym, and my phone, I had like 20 missed calls, all these different, text messages. Have you heard? Have you heard?
It's Jared. And I was like, was he shot? I know there's gonna be fatalities. Like, was he one of them? She's like, no, dude, he was the person who shot everyone.
And I was just beyond shock.
But what drove this lifelong resident of Tucson to commit such a devastating rampage? A ruthless spree that shook his local community to the core. At around 10:10 a.m. on the 8th of January 2011, Jared Loughner committed a deadly killing spree in Tucson, Arizona. In just 17 seconds, he emptied a 33-round magazine of its bullets into a waiting crowd. The ruthless attack would ultimately leave 6 dead and 13 wounded.
customers have tackled the suspect. They are holding him down at the Safeway.
In an act of heroism, bystanders subdued the shooter, ending the killing spree quickly as it had begun.
It was just an eerie scene of people dead, taking their last breaths.
There was some cries of panic, nothing loud, and then nothing.
5 minutes after the last bullet was fired, police arrived on the scene, where Loughner was immediately placed in handcuffs and removed from the devastating aftermath of his killing spree.
The first thing he said to law enforcement is, I want everyone to know that there was no one else involved. He wanted everyone to know that this was him and him alone.
With Loughner safely in custody, people began to take stock of themselves and those around them.
Jared Loughner at this time was in the back of the car, of one of the police cars. To be honest, I didn't pay him any mind at that point because we needed to render aid to the victims. There wasn't that mass chaos, a mass of people running like you would almost expect. It's almost like they came together and began to help each other.
I had my blinders on, and I was taking care of the people that were right here.
I'm laying there, my glasses are broken. I grabbed my cell phone out of my pocket and I clipped my number here at the house, and Sally answered the phone and I said, Sally, I've been shot, but I'm okay, but I need you here right away.
I actually said to him, what do you mean? I thought maybe there'd been a robbery. I simply didn't know. He told me where he was, and when I got off the phone, I immediately forgot. I was just absolutely in shock.
A 9-year-old child was also amongst the victims that morning.
Well, the one memory that I don't think I will ever be able to purge from my brain is looking over and seeing one-handed CPR being done on a tiny little 9-year-old girl.
I realized how desperate it was when somebody came up to me and said, there's a little girl, and it doesn't look like she's going to make it.
Tragically, on the way to hospital, she died. Amongst those critically wounded was Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, with a serious gunshot wound to the head. Jared Loughner's bloody rampage had left 13 people seriously wounded and 6 dead.
Bill did what he did by knocking this man to the ground and holding him there was of absolutely no surprise to me whatsoever, because that's Bill's character. That's how Bill's made.
Along with the young child, 5 adults were also victims of the brutal spree. Dorothy Morris, Judge John Roll, Phyllis Scheck, Dorwin Stoddard, and Gabe Zimmerman all lost their lives at the hands of one man, Jared Lee Loughner. The 9th of March 2011, Arizona Superior Court. Jared Lee Loughner was initially charged on 49 counts. If he was found guilty, he would face the death sentence.
At his first court hearing in May 2011, he had an outburst. He was disconnected from what was going on.
I think Jared Loughner was a very confused young man who was spiraling into madness.
Throughout the proceedings, Loughner's behavior deteriorated, and he had to be forcibly removed from court. Deemed unfit to stand trial, he was remanded in custody, where his mental health declined further.
He was in just terrible shape. He was psychotic, he was having hallucinations, At one point, he paced for 50 hours in his cell, got open literally for 50 hours straight. He got open sores on his feet. Those became infected.
26th of June, 2011. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, the trial judge ruled that Loughner should be forcibly medicated with antipsychotics.
There is a possibility that Loughner believed he was killing evil people. He was doing us a big favor, ridding the world of evil. And this was just an act that he knew he had to fulfill because these were very bad forces working on our society, and he was doing us a favor.
After 14 months, he was deemed competent to stand trial, where the prosecution was seeking the death penalty.
I think he and his representation saw the writing on the wall. He would have been executed.
In an eventual plea bargain, Loughner admitted guilt to 19 of the 49 original charges, including attempted assassination of a congresswoman, the murder of 2 federal employees, causing the death of 4 others, attempted murder of 2 federal employees, and injuring 10 others through the use of a pistol.
The shooting really shook this town. People reacted with grief, mourning, just utter shock.
I've always known that I was going to see things that most people don't see, but never to the magnitude of this incident.
We survived, so we try to be a voice for the people who will no longer have a voice.
By admitting his guilt, Loughner avoided the death penalty.
That day will be forever emblazoned on my mind and in my heart and on my soul as the very worst day of my life.
Jared Lee Loughner was given 7 consecutive life terms plus 140 years, meaning under current law, he will never be released.
Now this guy has got to spend the rest of his life living with the consequences of what he did.
Since the shooting spree, mental health and gun control laws have again become the focus of fierce debate throughout America.
I think for our people who have mental problems, we need to help them. We can't just push them out there and let them do something like this.
It kind of drew a line in of who do you really know? You say you know someone, but do you really know them?
You were not going to find the red flags in his childhood. And that's because he had a genetically determined illness, schizophrenia, that doesn't appear in terms of symptoms until an individual is in his late teens or early 20s. You get a different Jared Loughner at that point. And this one turned out to be extremely violent.
In 2011, a 28-hour killing spree unfolded in New York City.
The amount of mayhem and murder that he left behind is truly amazing.
Slashing his way through the streets.
There was a whole pool of blood near that tree over there.
Maxim Gelman was a man on a mission of murder.
It was almost as he was a robot and he was programmed to kill.
As the clock ticked, the body count rose.
It seems to me he was going to kill anybody in his way.
And with it the question, what caused this small-time crook to commit his killing spree?
He knew what he did was wrong, but he simply didn't care.
New York, the 12th of February 2011. 9 a.m. The typical hustle and bustle of the city that never sleeps belied the fact that this was a day unlike any other. A killing spree was underway.
There were hundreds of cops and detectives that were assigned to this. We were pulling people from all over the place. Anybody who was working at that point in the Detective Bureau was assigned to this case.
Detectives were frantically searching for Maxim Gelman, the man who over the last 28 hours had left 4 dead and 3 critically injured in a string of vicious stabbings, random carjackings, and indiscriminate assaults.
He was being reckless. He was committing crimes in public. He was driving around at a high rate of speed.
Concerns were mounting that the out-of-control killer would soon strike again.
Not only are you trying to contain what's happening, but you're trying to find this guy so that he doesn't hurt anybody else. So there is a lot of pressure that's put on the police department in a situation like this.
He was, it seems, becoming more and more unhinged and perhaps becoming more and more dangerous at the same time.
The hunt for Maxim Gelman sprawled across the length and breadth of the city.
New York City is a big place. You can hide just about anywhere. This is a dynamic situation that we're dealing with. We have enough resources in New York City to do this. We have the dogs and the helicopters and the license plate readers and the cars and the number of cops. But still, he's all over the place. And we don't know where he's going to pop up next.
The indiscriminate nature of the crimes committed meant that even a chance encounter with New York's most wanted man could prove fatal.
There was a sense of danger because people were realizing their life could be threatened. And it would not be because he hated them or because he had a grudge against them. It was because he was a guy who was out on the streets in public with knives and who was willing, apparently, to attack and maybe even kill anybody who got in his way.
That same morning, Joe Lozito, a box office ticket seller from Philadelphia, was taking his daily commute into Manhattan, unaware of the drama that was unfolding.
I got up super early. I had to make the commute, and everything that he had done the day before had not yet made it to the Philadelphia papers. So I was going into the city blind. I had no idea.
While his day had begun like any other, Joe would make a seemingly innocent decision that would change his life.
When I arrived at Penn Station that day, there was construction on the 1 train on the tracks. So when I got up to the platform, I had to make a decision. Do I stay on this platform or do I go to the other platform? For whatever reason this day, I decided, well, let me go to the other platform. It's double the trains. I'll get to work a lot quicker.
A suspected sighting of the spree killer had investigators scouring the subway system.
He was known to be in one set of tunnels connected to one subway line in one section of Manhattan. It was at this point that the cordon began tightening.
The thing that really sent up a red flag were 2 police officers got on the train and they went right into the motorman's compartment.
So the police are actually driving with the conductors going southbound trains and northbound trains, looking through the tunnels because this is where we believe he is.
What I noticed is when they got on, their radios were blasting. They were on full blast. They were loud, they were active, and it was definitely different than the norm. Finally, the doors closed, and now we're moving at a snail's pace. So then I was really like, what's going on here?
As the train finally pulled away from Penn Station, Joe was about to come face to face with Maxim Gelman, the most wanted man in New York City.
This guy just walks right in front of me and starts banging on the door to the motorman's compartment. And he looked kind of dirty, disheveled. And he starts banging on the door and he says, "Let me in." And I'm sitting here going, what is going on with this guy?
And lo and behold, Max is on the train where the cops are riding with the conductors looking for him. Max turns around and he focuses in on one of the passengers who happened to be probably the biggest guy on the train, this guy Joe Lozito.
So the next thing I know, he's about 2 feet from me and about 3 feet from the door, looks right down at me. I look up at him, we make eye contact. He takes out this big knife, looks me dead in the eye and says, "You're gonna die."
In 2011, New York City would be struck by a killing spree. Carrying out a series of stabbings, carjackings and assaults, Maxim Gelman would stalk the streets for 28 hours. 1994, New York City. 17 years before the deadly spree, 6-year-old Maxim Gelman and his mother Svetlana immigrated to the United States from Ukraine, settling in the Sheep's Head Bay neighborhood at Brooklyn's southern tip.
His father had left him early on in life. His mother remarried, lived with his mom and his stepfather. He had no brothers and sisters. He was an only child.
His early years would entail a succession of setbacks and personal struggles to find acceptance in his new surroundings.
Max, when he was young, he was an outsider. He definitely didn't have a lot of friends. Maybe felt shy or wasn't confident enough in himself. I guess that's what kind of made him into a worse person.
Gelman's childhood was filled with trouble. His potential for killing was something that developed early and remained with him until he was in his early 20s.
Life at home was also turbulent for the young Maxim.
Max and his family, he wasn't so great with them.
Max expressed some dislike in the way his stepfather treated his mother.
He, loved and respected his mother, but his stepfather never respected him. He would always refer to his father as asshole in front of anyone. I don't think that they ever had a normal relationship.
It turned out to be a somewhat violent relationship.
Gelman's battles with his stepfather were repeated, and the pair's obvious lack of affection for one another would prove an omen for the pointed altercation that was to come. The 11th of February 2011, 5 a.m. The now 23-year-old Maxim Gelman was on the way to visit his mother. It was to be for the last time.
Maxim Gelman went to his mother's house looking for his passport. Max thought he was being followed by the FBI and the DEA, and he just called them the feds a lot of times. And he was worried that the police were onto him because he was an alleged drug dealer, and he wanted to flee the country.
He got there, he knocked on the door, he got in.
And this is where he runs into his stepfather.
Of course, at this point, Maxim appears to have been behaving in a pretty erratic fashion. That could have been enough to start tension with anybody.
Believed to be under the influence of drugs, Gelman's curious behavior quickly began to arouse the suspicions of his parents.
Max got into an argument with his mother and his stepfather regarding the car. He wanted the keys because his feeling, and one might call delusions about the DEA out to get him.
His behavior was really unusual. He was becoming more disturbing.
The tensions rising inside the Gelman house were about to erupt.
Something in Max's head at that point snapped, and he picked up the weapon of opportunity at that point, which was the knife.
Unleashing a display of savage violence, Maxim's anger would boil over into murder.
He stabbed his stepfather over 50 times.
A knife is a much more personal weapon. Almost anybody can be trained to pull a trigger, but to actually plunge a knife into the body of a victim until he's dead indicates a tremendous amount of anger.
The wounds were incredibly severe. He couldn't have survived that. It was a very close range stab, and that sort of gave me the impression that Max was acting out of some sort of more than natural rage.
The other thing, of course, it can tell us about Gelman is that Gelman was a very spontaneous individual, and his rage was very quick to flourish and long-lasting.
After his mother called 911, NYPD detective Joe Giacalone would begin to coordinate a response to Gelman's crime.
At that point, it was just a domestic violence murder. That's the way it was being handled. It was a fight between the stepfather and the stepson, and it ended in murder. And that we were looking for this guy, Maxim Gelman. We knew his name at this point, but we didn't understand the consequences of what else was happening.
With the information available in these early stages, few could have foreseen the frenzy that was to come. With the blood of his stepfather on his hands and authorities heading his way, Gelman fled.
So he figures he needs to get out of town at this point, so he takes everything and he leaves. Initially, from what we know, he was on his way out, and then decided to come back in and figure now he wants to settle some scores.
While detectives began their investigation at the Gelman house, Maxim would head back into the city and towards the home of 20-year-old Yelena Bulchenko.
Wait, just make the camera lower so it's not like I'm being recorded.
Yelena was a very pretty girl. She was smart. She was funny. Very sensitive, very sweet girl. And we already made plans for Valentine's Day. You know, I bought her a heart necklace. Everything was set in place.
Yelena and Gerard were no strangers to Maxim Gelman.
Me, Yelena, and him had driven to Long Island to visit someone, and things went well. I mean, there was nothing out of the ordinary. We were with each other basically for most of the morning.
Gelman, however, seemed to believe that he and Yelena were more than just friends.
He really liked her, and she didn't feel that way.
His attitude towards relationships with women was one scarred by a sordid early encounter.
He never really had a girlfriend, and I think what really tore him from reality is his first sexual experience. He had sex with a girl from the high school, and I think after that he ended up getting a serious STD. How he told me was that he has lumps and that they weren't able to be even surgically removed. He kind of knew that he wouldn't be able to have a normal life anymore. Him and Yelena would really never be able to be a couple.
He fixated on Yelena, an individual who showed him some kindness in passing, and that became so much more meaningful to him because he had nothing else in his life.
Although his advances were rejected, Gelman would continue to pursue Yelena.
Yelena changed her number because Max kept on, calling her over and over and over again, to the point where she didn't want to have that. She didn't want it to be bothered. She was in a relationship with me. She didn't want to, be stalked.
I think Yelena's rejection really caused him to kind of become a stalker.
He had showed up at her house one time. He was looking for her. He started banging on the door, going crazy. saying, I'll kill you if you don't open the door, and all these different types of things.
She had really little interest in speaking with him, but the way he was reacting to her made some people say, in retrospect, that there were warning signs that he could become very dangerous.
The 11th of February 2011, 10 a.m., 5 hours since the spree began. Sheepshead Bay, New York. Located merely a few blocks from the scene of his previous crime, Gelman would arrive at the Bulchenko residence.
He drove to Yelena's mother's house and confronted her while she was on the phone.
The person that was on the phone was able to overhear the conversation that was going on. And from what the caller stated was that you could tell it was an argument right off the bat. Max wanted to know where Yelena was. And Yelena's mom didn't want to give it up.
Anna's refusal to divulge the details of her daughter's whereabouts meant she would face the sharp end of Maxim's violent temper.
Max grabs the knife. He just puncturing, the mother, like torturing her kind of thing, where he's trying to get information out of her where Yelena is.
I think that Max probably knew that he was not going to get away with his crimes, and that it would more satisfy him to do what he had to do, and, in terms of the consequences, let him, he didn't care.
And eventually, I think Max just gets tired of the game that he's playing with her, and he finally plunges the knife into her and kills her.
The injuries were similar to the injuries to his stepfather, pretty much violent, multiple stab wounds.
Anna is protecting her daughter at all costs, and she makes the ultimate sacrifice.
Oblivious to the horrors unfolding at her home, Yelena would get wind of Gelman's earlier crimes.
Yelena got a phone call letting her know that, Max had killed his father in the morning. This is around 3 o'clock, 3:30, as Yelena's walking home.
Max got back in his car, and he was driving up and down the blocks and just looking for any sign of her. And during this time period, Yelena comes home.
On her arrival, Yelena would be confronted by a scene of cruel violence.
She discovered her mother's body and, freaked out, as anybody would. It was a terribly horrendous, bloody scene.
And she is now outside of her house, crying, and she's calling on the cell phone, calling the police, calling anybody who will, come and help her.
I get a phone call out of nowhere from Yelena's friend. And she tells me, Yelena's mom has been stabbed. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? At first, I thought, this was a stupid prank call. I was like, stop playing with me. It's not cool. She's like, no, I'm serious. Yelena just got off the phone with me. So I was like, all right, I'm on my way.
Yet, unbeknownst to Gerard, he was not the only one heading in Yelena's direction.
At this time, Max arrives back at the house after failing to find her at work or out in the street. To see him there, she probably put 2 and 2 together pretty quickly. So she runs to a neighbor.
Gerard's concern for the safety of his girlfriend would quickly develop.
We were just driving as fast as possible, running red lights, doing whatever we needed to do to get there. I kept on calling and calling. The more I kept on trying, the more nervous I became. And I started going crazy in the back seat of the car. This can't be real. This can't be happening. I started crying, going crazy, yelling, screaming. Get there, get there. You gotta be there. We gotta get there. We gotta know what's going on.
As an argument ensued outside the Bulchenko home, Gelman was determined to take revenge against Yelena for her rejection of him.
Max basically overpowers a neighbor and just goes to kill her. And he stabs her. And he walks away. He gets in the car, and I guess he figures that, what happens if she's still alive? So he gets back out of the car, and basically in front of people, he stabs her again. He really wanted her dead.
"11 hours into his spree, Maxim Gelman was now responsible for the death of a third innocent victim.
My friends and I parked right near the police barricade, and I just jumped over the barricade. And, there was cops all in front of her house. And I ran over near her house, and then I guess the police didn't see me at first. So the police grabbed me and said, "Who are you? Who are you?" I was like, I'm her boyfriend. Where is she? And she wasn't there, and there was a whole pool of blood on near that tree over there. And you could just see that this is something that doesn't normally happen. Something outrageous, something crazy.
On examining the evidence at their disposal, the reality of the danger they were facing began to dawn on detectives.
After this incident, the police are starting to put two and two together, that there is a link between all of these murders. And if we don't stop this guy, he's going to kill more people. There's no question about it. The most dangerous person to deal with in the world is that person who has nothing to lose.
The 11th of February 2011, 4:30 p.m. A killing spree was underway in New York. The normally quiet neighborhood of Sheepshead Bay was at its epicenter. Having murdered his stepfather at 5 a.m. that morning, Maxim Gelman had now claimed the lives of 3 in little over 11 hours. As investigators descended on the scene of his latest double crime, the slayings of mother and daughter Anna and Yelena Bulchenko, an increasingly out-of-control Gelman would attempt to evade their attentions.
Max fled in a hurry after killing Yelena.
Max just was enraged and determined to kill.
In making his getaway, Gelman would again demonstrate his apparent disregard for anyone who might stand in his way.
As he's fleeing, he runs over Stephen Tannenbaum, who was an older gentleman. He was actually a coin collector and dealer, and he was in the crosswalk, and Max just ran him down. And he was pretty much dead at the scene. He just kept on driving, didn't stop, didn't flinch, he just kept on going.
Now that detectives understood they were dealing with a spree of connected killings, their efforts to apprehend the culprit would intensify. However, finding one man amongst a city of millions posed police with a significant problem.
You have to learn how to play chess as the police, where you have to think sometimes 2 or 3 moves ahead of the bad guy. One of the first steps when you're what we call hunting for a known perpetrator is you try to find out where they've been in the past, where they've lived, who their friends are, if he's ever been arrested anywhere else, because these are the places that you'd likely show up again.
Leaving no stone unturned, detectives would enlist known associates of Gelman to assist with the search.
We got a strong knock on our door, and I opened it, and there were probably around 8 detectives asking me about Max. And they said, Max murdered someone, but they asked me to maybe help them to look for him. I was basically driving with the police, and it was really insane. I couldn't believe the amount of police that there were outside.
Gelman, however, was able to stay one step ahead of his pursuers, turning his knowledge of the city's abandoned train tracks to his advantage.
The train tracks that Maxim Gelman apparently used as a getaway route are in a really desolate area. They run along a sunken bed that cuts through neighborhoods.
His understanding of this underground network had developed during his years as a graffiti writer.
When we would write together, we only wrote like in places where it was kind of abandoned, where nobody would be around us.
Maxim would use his artistic outlet to express his attitudes on the way he viewed the world.
He would write things like, nothing to lose, you know, just these like hopeless kind of quotes. I guess he was looking for help, but didn't know how to find it.
His reputation as an eccentric would also develop amongst those that moved in the same circles.
He would make, you know, voices. If a gangster or what you see on TV, you know, a mobster, when he would start an altercation with somebody, he would talk to them in this voice. And people just thought, like, what's wrong with this guy? He was just, you know, I guess a sick person.
Gelman's affectations towards the gangster lifestyle would eventually be reflected in his reality.
From what I know, he was selling, you know, cocaine, he was selling heroin, you know, he was selling pills and all types of different things.
He was involved in terms of his drug use with angel dust, or PCP.
It's a drug that's not common amongst drug users because of the ill effects that it has. It takes over a person's whole mind.
It can lead to aggressive, violent behavior.
Years before the spree began, friends would come face to face with Maxim's violent unpredictability.
I'm just walking down the street, and Max sees me in his car, and he pulls over, and he jumps out with a knife. And he definitely wanted to, you know, cause harm to me. And he was, you know, basically jabbing a knife at me. Max was very unpredictable, and he was very dangerous. You know, this was somebody who you can't imagine is actually out on the streets.
The 12th of February 2011, 1 a.m. Crown Heights, Brooklyn. 5 miles away and 8 hours on from his last confirmed sighting, Maxim Gelman would begin the second stage of his ever-escalating spree.
Maxim Gelman had not been seen for several hours, but around 1 a.m. he showed up in Crown Heights, some distance away from Midwood, where the police were looking for him.
Max shows back up on the grid, and he decides that he needs another car. He needs to still get away, so he comes across a livery cab that's parked on the side of the road.
For the driver of the cab, Fitz Fullerton, it would be a fare he would never forget.
Maxim got into the back seat. Then, as they were driving along, he attempted to commandeer the cab. He tried to take it over, and the taxi crashed, and Maxim fled.
He had stabbed the driver, and he had left. So, you know, fortunately, he survives. Now Max is still on the hunt for another car. And now he probably realizes once this gets notified to the police that the police are going to have a beat on him where he's showing up next.
Gelman, however, was not to be deterred in his quest to commandeer a car. A matter of minutes later, and little more than a mile away from the Fitz Fullerton scene, he would strike again.
He comes across Sheldon Pottinger, who is outside of a church waiting for his family to come out. He jumps into the car, and he takes off in the car. He stabs Sheldon, and he tells him, as he's driving 60, 70 miles an hour, he tells him to get out. And can you imagine being in this position where you've just been stabbed, you're carjacked, and now you're driving 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, wherever it may be, and he tells you your best bet is to jump out of a car to survive. Well, Sheldon jumps out of the car. He miraculously survives.
This guy was driving fast, and I pushed myself out of the car, hold a knife, and I open the door, I push myself out, and I fell on the floor. I get up and I start running. I run back down to the church.
Gelman would, however, leave behind a clue that would prove crucial in his undoing.
He abandoned the Nissan near a subway station in Queens, and what he did for the next few hours is unclear.
When we found out about Sheldon Pottinger's car, that license plate immediately transmitted to every police officer in the city that's working. and a couple of patrol cops in Queens stumble upon the car near the subway station. So the police start to put two and two together that he probably hopped on a train.
With detectives now alerted to Gelman's most recent movements, the elusive killer would once again go to ground.
He was next seen hours later, around 8:30 a.m., in the subway system in Manhattan.
As the spree entered its 28th hour, news of Gelman's exploits had made the front page.
Max is on the downtown train, and as he's walking through the cars, he sees his face on the front of one of the newspapers. And he pretty much, knocks the paper out of the woman's hand.
She became very frightened and upset. She got off the subway. She found police officers on the subway platform and told them that she was pretty sure she had just encountered Maxim Gelman.
The irrationality of Gelman clearly shows that he wasn't acting on thought or cognition. Gelman, of course, is a spontaneous reactor. He's not a planner, he's not a thinker, he's just enjoying the high and living it while he can.
With reports regarding Gelman's whereabouts reaching police, the focus of the citywide search would narrow, centering in on the network of tunnels running beneath the streets.
There are very few ways to get out of the subway system. In order for him to get out of that subway system now, it would take like an act of Houdini to get out.
Gelman, it seemed, had backed himself into a corner.
The police set up a checkpoint at Penn Station. Max's train was coming their way.
Yet even with the odds of escape stacked against him, Gelman would make another move that kept him a step ahead of the pursuing police.
He got off that train and left not via the platform, but jumped onto the subway tracks, crossed several tracks, and then pulled himself into a train going the opposite direction.
And he is actually heading towards the busiest transit hub probably in the world, Times Square.
With nowhere left to run, Maxim Gelman would make one last desperate play, and in doing so, thrust unsuspecting commuter Joe Lazito to the center of the story.
Max decides that he's going to hijack the train. So he's banging on the door of the conductor.
He was banging on the door. He was announcing that he was an official visitor.
And at this point, Max turns around and he grabs a hold of Joe Lazito.
I looked in his eyes, he looked in my eyes. There was nothing there. It was the whole lights are on, but nobody's home. I mean, it was almost as he was a robot and he was programmed to kill. The part where he takes the knife out really happened in slow motion. The initial stab almost seemed matter-of-factly. He took out the knife, it was huge and it was filthy, and he plunges the knife right into my face right here. I said, okay, we're in a fight now. There's no thought process. It's like you're in a savage mode. It's just survival. I kind of propelled myself from the seat. Now he has free reign of the back of my head. And obviously at that point, I can't see what he looks like. When he was stabbing me, when he was slicing me, it was just a sense of urgency trying to get the knife away from me. The first time he swung up at me, I tried to catch his wrist, and I missed, and he sliced me in the thumb. The second time he sliced up at me, I missed again, and he sliced my tricep. Finally, the third time, he sliced his arm up, I caught it with my hand, I slammed his hand down, and the knife came out. That's how I disarmed him.
After 28 hours, Gelman's cruel killing spree had been brought to an end by the bravery of just one man.
After I disarmed him, that's when the police came out of the motorman's compartment and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You can get up, we got him."
Yet despite Joe's heroics, the injuries he had sustained were severe.
While this was going on, I am sitting on the subway seat. I just looked at Gelman and I said, you better hope I die, because if I don't, I'm going to come back and kill you.
In February 2011, New York City was subject to a 28-hour killing spree. Beginning in Brooklyn, Maxim Gelman would take the lives of 4 and injure 4 more in a series of stabbings, carjackings and assaults. The spree would finally come to a close in the center of the Manhattan subway system, after passenger Joe Lozito disarmed New York's most wanted man in hand-to-hand combat.
About 9 o'clock in the morning, this finally came to a conclusion when the officer was able to handcuff him and get an ambulance, get some help for the passenger that had been stabbed. I mean, this poor guy was very fortunate to be alive.
In the aftermath of the altercation, Joe was now left fighting for survival.
While I was sitting there and watching my life pour out of me, I'm screaming, we have to get this train moving. I'm gonna die. I can't die on this train. When they lifted me from the seat, I passed out. And when they put me down, I snapped out of it and I was up again. And that moment, that was the first time I had felt any pain. It was the worst pain I'd ever felt.
Joe would soon begin to learn just how lucky he was to be alive.
And I heard one of the officers call me likely, and I didn't know what that meant. And later on at the hospital, my sister, who was also a New York City police officer, she goes, "Joseph, do you know what that means?" I said, no. She goes, "That means likely to die."
Befitting the events of this unimaginable story, its end would come in one of New York's most iconic locations.
Ironically, this all occurs above 42nd Street in Times Square, the crossroads of the world. He's walked out of the subway into the back of a police car in front of thousands of people watching what's going on. When the word goes out that he was finally under police control, I mean, everybody, it was just a sigh of relief. I remember sitting in the office and going, whew, I thank God that's over.
Without the actions of Joe Lozito that morning, the number of victims claimed by Gelman could have been far higher.
I've been called a hero, and I'm so appreciative for it, but that's not me. I'm not a hero. I did what had to be done that day.
In court, Gelman would show little contrition. Instead, he would glory in the notoriety he had gained.
I would call his sentence a performance rather than a sentence.
His actions in Brooklyn court that day were like every other thing he's ever done. They're deplorable.
He kept on looking over to me, smiling, saying stupid things under his breath towards me, looking at me.
I had to take measures to stop him from talking, but he always wanted to get it out. I don't know if he was trying to create that gangster persona because he knew that he was going to spend the rest of his life in jail.
However, despite his despicable behavior, the victims of his crimes would be given a chance to have the last word.
I tried my best, to keep my cool, but he kept on looking at me, and he kept on giving me a smirk and laughing or smiling. And that's what got me. I mean, in my mind, I was thinking, can I kill him in the courtroom? So this is like looking in the face of evil. And I told him, I was like, you're gonna burn in hell.
I played out the scenario in my head about 1,000 times. I visualized what I wanted to say to him. It was a little nerve-wracking, to be honest, but I looked at Max and I told him I had waited over a year to look into those eyes again. I told him that, I hoped he enjoyed life in prison and that he had hell to look forward to.
Maxim Gelman would plead guilty to each of his 13 charges, including the murders of his stepfather, Alexander Kuznetsov, Anna and Yelena Bulchenko, and Stephen Tannenbaum. he would be sentenced to a total of 225 years behind bars. With the facts of this entirely unprecedented case established, a crucial question still burned brightly. What could have caused Maxim Gelman to conduct his killing spree?
Was his plan that day to do all these things, or was it just he snapped and went off on the deep end because of the father in the morning? You know, we'll never know.
At best, he had some form of paranoid element to his personality, where his ways of interpreting the world and understanding what the world means is seriously disordered.
The only motivation I could think that Max would try to do this is, he had a long history of drug use. Maybe the drugs, affected his brain in a certain way and just made him snap.
While there was never a determination that Max was legally insane, he was certainly exhibiting evidence of psychosis and sociopathic and psychopathic behavior. So that's the place they're in. They're in a different place than a normal human being.
Upbringing probably has a lot to do with it. But there are productive members of society who had terrible upbringings, and they were able to overcome it.
You know, we know that he was not suffering from some severe mental illness. He knew what he did was wrong, but he simply didn't care. He chose to do it, and he was able to kill with moral impunity.
I think Gelman could represent a new, different type of spree killer that we haven't really seen much of before. He's an incidental spree killer. He's trying to escape, he's desperate to get away, and he will kill people if he has to.
There is little doubt that the lives of those who lost loved ones will never be the same again.
Elena was a beautiful girl, smart, had an enormous future in front of her that was taken, Her brother lost a sister, her brother lost a mother, her father lost everybody. He's in the house alone now. And I just hope that Maxim is suffering.
I sit here before you today knowing how lucky I am, because I have no business being here. I should be dead. I should have been his fifth victim.
For Gerard, of all the difficult questions posed by the events of that day, the hardest one to ask is what if?
I drive around this neighborhood a lot, and I never come up the block. It just brings me back to that day. It feels like it was yesterday, You keep on thinking in your head, if I was here, or if I didn't go to work that day, or if I was here 20 minutes, 30 minutes earlier, could I have stopped him? Get the hell out of here. It's a little bit much.
In 1982, 40-year-old George Emil Banks embarked on a ruthless rampage that would shock America to the core.
Something in him just snapped.
When he pulled the gun up and aimed it at me, I knew he was going to pull the trigger.
As the clock ticked, the body count rose.
Right about in here is where the two victims were laying, right on the street.
And with it the question, why had the ex-prison guard from Pennsylvania brutally murdered his own flesh and blood?
There was a lady holding a baby. He shot her and the baby.
And committed a brutal killing spree that would ultimately claim 13 lives in a matter of hours.
Butt of the rifle was coming through the window, and George started screaming at us, he's going to kill everybody.
Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. During the 1950s and 60s, this once prosperous city in the northeast of the United States suffered a collapse of a booming coal mining industry, making life tough going for its residents. The city's economy partially recovered during the 1970s, But this decade of growth also experienced a huge setback in the form of a colossal tropical storm. Wilkes-Barre endured almost $1 billion worth of damage. But one of the worst moments in the city's turbulent history would undoubtedly be remembered for the actions of just one man during one unforgettable night. On an early September morning in 1982, the residents of Wilkes-Barre woke to the horrifying news that one of America's worst ever mass murders had just been committed on their very doorstep, and the man responsible had still not been caught.
It was horrific. It's something that you would only see in a movie.
Hundreds of police officers, along with countless journalists and onlookers, had surrounded a nondescript two-story house on Monroe Street. Detective Jim Zardecki was one of the first on the scene.
All of a sudden we heard the smashing of the glass, and I looked up there at that window, and the butt of the rifle was coming through the window.
Inside, one man was engaged in a standoff.
I heard policemen yell, "We have him in our sights." And I'm thinking, are they going to kill him?
The man sheltered behind the second-floor window was George Emil Banks, who, in a matter of hours, had embarked on a killing spree that had left 13 people dead. 7 of the victims were children. But what had driven this 40-year-old Wilkes-Barre resident to embark on such a violent killing spree, and why had he ended up barricaded into an empty building on Monroe Street just hours later? 2:30 a.m., the 25th of September 1982, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, just 10 hours before the siege on Monroe Street. Several miles away, a 22-year-old, James Olson, had been attending a house party.
It was a pre-Halloween party. All of our friends got together, and some were dressed up, some weren't. We were in the house partying. Everybody having drinks, having fun. It was actually a good party. I went outside to get another bottle of booze out of my trunk of my car. And this is when we heard the noises. It's like somebody's throwing firecrackers. We couldn't figure out what it was. So then we just see this gentleman walk out of the house with the camo. He had a camo hat on. My buddy Ray Hall says to him, "Hey, I know you," and pointed to him. And he turned the gun, he had the gun at his side like this, picked the gun up and shot him. I thought they were pulling a gag on me. It wasn't a gag, it's far from it. Especially when he turned the gun to me and said, "You're not gonna live long enough to tell nobody about this." All I can remember is the eyes. He just had that look about him, like, this is it. I knew he was gonna pull the trigger. That's something that's in my head and will be there probably for the rest of my life.
Across the other side of town, Jim Zardecki was at home when his night's sleep was cut short.
I got a call from our chief deputy coroner telling me that there was a homicide in Wilkes-Barre.
Whilst Zardecki raced across the city, local police were arriving on the scene at Schoolhouse Lane. There they found James Olson and Ray Hall critically wounded.
And when I got shot, the bullet, when it went through, it just like pulled the life out of me. It's like Jesus Christ himself reached down and like pulled my insides out. Like it was just a really empty feeling.
Leaving 2 men for dead, the gunman was immediately on the move.
He walked down the street backwards, holding the rifle like this. Walked down the street, and from what my friends tell me, of course, because I was already shot at the time, he had put the gun to someone's head at the end of the street and stole their car.
Local tow truck driver Bobby Kadlubowski was working the area when he came across the unfolding events.
The night of the shooting, this was the scene where was lined with police, ambulances, and all type of rescue units and stuff. And right in this general area right here, probably right about Right about in here is where the two victims were laying, right on the street.
Police frantically tried to save Ray Hall's life.
The officer actually had a rag trying to stop the blood flow, and I just knew in my heart that this guy wasn't going to make it.
Ray Hall died at the scene, whilst James Olson was rushed to hospital with serious gunshot wounds. Police began to piece together the chain of events. Witnesses reported that the man suspected of the shooting had exited a building just meters away. The same building from which James and Ray had heard strange noises emanating only moments earlier. What police discovered inside turned an apparent shooting of two into a fully fledged killing spree.
When we came in and we walked into the house, I was able to see the bodies just strewn all over the living room at that point in time.
I looked around, I saw bodies covered up, blood on the walls. I just turned around and went back out. I didn't want to see any more.
The house belonged to 40-year-old ex-prison guard George Emil Banks. Inside, 8 members of his family lay dead, and Banks was nowhere to be found. In the early hours of the 25th of September 1982, Wilkes-Barre police reported to a house party where 2 people had been shot, one fatally. As they investigated further, the apparent shooting of 2 turned out to be far worse. In a house just meters away, they discovered the bodies of 3 women and 5 children. The hunt was on to catch a spree killer, and ex-prison guard George Emil Banks was identified as the prime suspect. George Banks was born to mixed-race parents on the 22nd of June 1942.
His mother was white, his father was black, and in his early days, growing up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where you had a African-American population of far less than 1%, and coming from a biracial family, for George Banks, that was extremely difficult.
During the early 1940s, parts of America were still struggling with segregation.
At that time period when George was growing up, there was still some racial tensions, between African Americans and whites. So it wasn't exactly the best time period to grow up in, but, his family tried to make the best of it.
Banks's parents never married, and the family's racial mix seemed to torment him throughout his life.
Psychiatrists would say, of course, that the experiences George went through could lead to him hating himself and disliking his own black identity. The fact that he was mixed race made him feel he wasn't accepted by either black people or white people in the community.
George continued to struggle with this perceived racial prejudice throughout his late teens, prompting him to enlist into the military as a means of escaping his troubled youth.
So after high school, George enrolled in the military, but the problem was George wasn't the type of person who liked to take orders. He always liked to be in control of his own life. He liked to be in control of others around him, so he couldn't take orders well from superiors, and that ultimately resulted in him getting an early discharge.
From this point on, Banks's life continued on a downward spiral, until at the age of 19, he found himself in serious trouble with the law.
One night, he and some accomplices tried to break into a local bar. The bar owner was there, and Banks shot him in the chest at point-blank range.
It was like a botched armed robbery. They ended up getting caught. I believe the sentence was 5 to 7 years he had received. However, while he was serving his time, he actually escaped during a work detail. He was caught within 5 hours, and they added another 1 to 7 years to his sentence.
After spending 7.5 years behind bars, Banks was finally released from prison and straight back into the community he had so despised as a youth. The 25th of September 1982, 3 a.m. 13 years after Banks's release from prison, police had been called to Schoolhouse Lane in Wilkes-Barre to investigate the shooting of 2 men. But on their arrival, they uncovered another bloody scene that was even harder to comprehend. The killing spree had actually started in a nearby property, the home of George Banks.
The policemen that were at the scene, who the first responders, had identified the culprit as being George Banks. When I walked in, there were multiple bodies in the house. And you start looking around and see that, you know, this was far more than just a normal homicide. It appeared to be a targeted murder at that time.
Banks had woken hours earlier, having partially slept off a cocktail of drink and drugs.
His killing spree was spontaneous. He actually may have snapped, and he may have suffered from some profound psychological disorder.
It was at that moment he decided to act. He picked up his AR-15 assault rifle. He put a 30-round clip in the gun.
His first victim was fellow resident Regina Clemens. Banks then made his way through the house, shooting as he went.
There were shell casings, bodies everywhere. It was just a horrific scene.
Within just a few moments, all of the occupants downstairs were dead. Banks then turned his attention to the second floor. He ruthlessly killed everyone in his path, even targeting defenseless children.
I can remember being absolutely shocked walking in there. I had been in the DA's office since 1972. I had seen literally, I thought, everything that there was to see.
When there becomes children involved, it really becomes much more of an emotional piece of the whole picture. And as you think about that and seeing young kids, it does have an impact of sadness and anger at the same time.
I didn't think that there was anything that I could have seen that would have affected me more than that until I walked into the scene at Schoolhouse Lane.
In total, 5 children and 3 women lay dead. Dorothy Lyons, along with sisters Regina Clemens and Susan Uhas, had been current girlfriends of Banks, living together as part of his harem. 4 of their children had been fathered by him.
These were typically women who he had found on the street, who might have been homeless, who came from bad home lives, and George offered them hope. You know, that's how it started out anyway.
The vulnerable women were all at least 10 years younger than Banks. They tragically felt that a shared life with him would offer a more secure future.
While his harem was developing and flourishing, it worked very well for Banks. He was able to control the women, he was able to control the children, and he was indeed the man of the house, of the kingdom.
For almost 10 years, life at Schoolhouse Lane had worked well for Banks. But in early September 1982, after losing his job, the pressure of supporting such a growing family began to take its toll. The 25th of September 1982, 3:30 a.m., Heather Highland Trailer Park. Having fled the first horrific scene, Banks, high on drink and drugs, had made a 10-minute drive to the home of his ex-girlfriend and mother to another of his children, Sharon Mazzillo.
So when George pulls up, he goes up to the door. Sharon knows it's him outside. You know, it's really early in the morning, so she goes to open the door and find out, you know, what the heck are you doing here?
Earlier in the year, Sharon had won a custody battle for their 5-year-old son, enraging Banks.
As she opens the door, she notices George is holding the assault rifle. And at that point, he shot her at point-blank range in the chest. She died almost instantly.
Pushing his way past the now fatally wounded Sharon, he continued on inside the trailer.
George Banks got in there. He shot his son. He shot his girlfriend. He shot his girlfriend's mother, who he absolutely hated. He shot one child who was not his child. but who we later learned had made fun of his child for being half African American.
With his savage spree escalating to new heights, Banks exited the horrific scene.
You know, at this point, as far as George is concerned, he's killed everybody in the home. He even says something to that effect out loud as he's leaving the house. You know, I've taken care of everyone here, or something along those lines. But unbeknownst to George, there was still 2 more people in the house.
The 2 boys, 13-year-old Keith Mazzillo and 11-year-old Angelo Mazzillo, had been hiding out in a cupboard and under a bed.
Both were able to sort of peek and see what happened, so they actually saw some of the killings.
As police descended on the scene, the 2 boys confirmed they had just witnessed Banks kill their family in cold blood.
They went inside, they saw all these bodies laying around, all this blood everywhere.
Seeing a child dead on the floor, it's overwhelming. I've seen, you know, hundreds of dead bodies over the period of time. I've gone to autopsies, but that whole thing, really, the massiveness of it is just something that makes it stand out above the rest.
Most spree killers are selective and methodical. They target particular individuals whom they believe are conspiring against them to make their lives miserable. And they want to get even with them. They want sweet revenge. A spree killer remains in a state of frenzy, probably because of his mental illness that makes him hyper and agitated and depressed all at the same time.
Having shot a further 4 dead, Banks left the trailer park physically and mentally exhausted.
Banks took himself to a nearby park and fell asleep. Partially, some of this will be because of the cocktail of alcohol and pills that he'd taken, but also part of it will be an adrenaline come down. Obviously, in killing his partners and children, it would have been a highly stressful situation. He would have been full of adrenaline, serotonin, free histamine. When that subsided, you will feel drained and fatigued, and you will need to have literally collapsed and rested.
Just over an hour into his killing spree, and Banks had so far brutally wiped out the lives of 13 people and committed what is known as a family annihilation.
Family annihilator is an individual, usually a male, who believes that death is better than life for his family. If a relationship breakdown is imminent, access to the children are a problem, we tend to find in family annihilators that they will murder the mother and children, sometimes family pets, and then sometimes obliterate the family home. Or in some cases, it's broadened out to extended family members in other residences nearby.
At around 5:30 a.m., Banks eventually woke in the east of the city. Still armed and dazed from the night before, the killer headed back into town.
Daylight's breaking over the city. You have all these law enforcement officers searching for George everywhere.
We had no idea where the suspect was at that point in time and if there was anybody else on his target list to go after. So that really put a lot of panic in a lot of people. You know, who's next, what's next, we gotta find this guy.
This time, Banks traveled straight to his mother's house. The 25th of September 1982, 5:30 a.m., Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, just 3 hours after 40-year-old George Emil Banks embarked on what became known as one of America's worst ever spree killings. The body count stood at 13 dead, including 5 of his own children, and the Wilkes-Barre police were nowhere near to catching him as they struggled to find a motive for the attacks. "13 years before his spree, in March 1969, after spending 7.5 years behind bars for his part in a botched armed robbery, 27-year-old George Banks had been released back into the community to start a new life on the straight and narrow. Slowly, after several years' hard work, Banks began to get his life back on track, with a growing family, including several girlfriends, and a property of his own in Schoolhouse Lane. Despite his previous felony, Banks had managed to get a job as a watchtower guard at the State Correctional Institution in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania.
For him to, be convicted and then become a prison guard and have tower duty, I mean, that's pretty good.
As a prison guard, his duties were in the tower. He was the guy who held the gun, who watched over the yard, he watched for escapees, and he really thrived in that job. It was a job he enjoyed doing, and it was a job he was good at.
Regardless of his seemingly stable existence, in the summer of 1982, at the age of 40, Banks's life began to unravel.
George started acting very strange. He went and got himself ordained. He started keeping a journal about his life.
Apparently, while he was up in the tower down at Camp Hill, he was talking about, wanting to shoot everybody down in the yard. So obviously, things were really beginning to unravel during that period of time.
This didn't go unnoticed by the prison. He started making comments like, sometimes I think about shooting myself in the head while I'm up in my prison tower. So they put George on sick leave to seek psychiatric help.
The truth behind Banks's fragile state of mind was actually far worse than authorities had suspected.
So at the same time George is dealing with these things at work, he's also preparing in the back of his mind. He's thinking there's going to be a race war, that this is something he has to prepare for.
What he experienced as a child growing up and the racial prejudice that he experienced is something that became part of him and something that he could not shed. And as a result of that, as life went on, his views became very distorted.
So he begins hoarding ammunition. He starts reading Soldier of Fortune magazines and, doing different things like that to prep himself for this war that, for some reason, he thinks is going to come.
The 25th of September, 1982, 5:30 a.m., Metcalf Street, just 3 hours after the killing spree had begun. Having woken in a field in the east of the city, a heavily armed but dazed George Emil Banks arrived at his mother's house.
So when George gets to his mother's house, he goes inside. She can tell there's something not right, and he just begins blabbering about everything. He says, I killed my family, I killed everyone, and his mom's listening to him, but at the same time she knows all these weird things, how George acts. It's nothing that's escaped her, so she decides to call Schoolhouse Lane to try to speak to one of his girlfriends.
Telephone rang, and I answered the phone, and it was George Banks's mother on the phone. And she started talking and saying that George had told her that something terrible had happened at Schoolhouse Lane.
George grabs the phone away from her. The officer tries to tell George, well, the kids are alive. You didn't kill them. They're still alive.
I came to the quick thought of just saying, well, yes, we're trying to take care of the children. We're trying to get them to the hospital. And he said, I know I killed them.
George said he didn't believe it. It was a lie, and he slammed down the phone.
We didn't know if he would kill his mother or kill himself or what would happen. Nobody or anybody else was in his target zone.
The police frantically established his mother's address and raced 3 miles across town to her house on Metcalf Street.
Let's go, let's get there, and let's apprehend him.
But whilst en route, Detective Zardecki learnt that Banks was again on the move.
We immediately regrouped to go to a house on Monroe Street, which we were understanding to be the place where George was held up.
With the police now closing in, Banks had fled his mother's house, managing to escape only a few miles away to the vacated property of a friend.
So once he's at Monroe Street, George knows that the police are going to come for him sooner or later. He gets prepared, he barricades all the doors, and in an unusual move, he places all these mirrors around the house. He puts them where, some people say, oh, he wanted to see if, law enforcement was sneaking up on him. Other people suspect he did it so his image would be cast there to draw away snipers. He was prepared, as he would say, to die. He was going to die there. He had his gun, he had extra ammo, he had this fortified home he had put together, and he was ready to die inside of it.
We had no idea what to expect on Monroe Street. We didn't know if he'd be locked in a house, if he was gone in to kill himself, if he had hostages. There was just no idea what to expect.
Detective Zardecki remembers arriving at the scene and being faced with an unpredictable situation as a standoff commenced.
Tension was huge at that time. Didn't know, would he come out firing? Would he shoot himself? All of a sudden we heard the smashing of the glass, and I looked up there at that window, and the butt of the rifle was coming through the window. And we heard this ranting and raving and screaming, and George started screaming at us, he's going to kill everybody. We dove underneath the car and just tried to talk back, to calm down. Talk to him, we want to talk to you, George, we want you to come down. He would go on about his kids, and he didn't want his kids to grow up in this white racist world. And much of his conversations and ranting were in that mindset of about the racist world, the white racist world, didn't want his kids to grow up. We kept trying to convince him his kids were alive at that point in time.
Banks' question to the police, are the children still alive, indicates to me that he had very mixed feelings about having taken their lives.
Finally, Detective Zardecki and his team had an idea for the motive behind the spree. By killing his children, Banks thought he could spare them the torment of the inevitable race war, a perceived battle that he had supposedly endured throughout his own life.
His attitude about race overwhelmed his thought process. He perceived that his children may be generals in the racial war. He had planned escape routes from Wilkes-Barre where he was going to store food. That at night he would go out in Wilkes-Barre dressed in black with a rifle and pretend he was part of this racial war.
George was preparing for the standoff because, as he would later say, he wanted to die. He had killed all his children, he had killed his family, he had, as he would say, saved some of them from this race war, and now he himself was preparing for death. He had it in his head that these law enforcement officers, that they were out to get him.
At 7:20 a.m., with Banks cornered, police attempted to contain the situation.
They knew George was armed, they knew he had a lot of ammunition, and they had to deal with the situation and try to do so without anyone getting hurt.
George Banks that night was wearing a T-shirt that said, kill them all and let God sort it out.
We came all the way over to this area, and at that point in time, we moved up into here, and I remember I had Detective Mitchell and Detective DeSoy were on the corner of this porch. And I was laying on the ground at that point in time.
As police began positioning themselves around the siege building, more and more bystanders descended on the chaotic scene.
We started having people all back in this area. Cars were coming through, all on the other side back in that area. We had people coming through. News trucks were coming down here. There were people and news media all over the creation.
At times, it was really almost a circus atmosphere.
You have approximately 150 law enforcement officers were on the scene. You had state police, you had local police, you had law enforcement officers from all over the county responding to the scene.
1 hour in, and an end to the siege seemed no closer. Banks remained in a position of control over the officers below.
We had people literally who were in harm's way that had no body armor, that had merely rifles or handguns that could have been picked off very easily.
He was a trained sniper. He could easily take people out, and he would later say, you know, he had more than one officer within his sights.
By 8:15 a.m., Zardecki and his team knew they had to somehow open up a line of communication if they were going to end the standoff.
We were here for several hours during the whole siege, and we went through a series of events.
So they tried to speak with him over the bullhorn. You know, he wasn't responsive. Sometimes he would yell different things out the window at him, but he didn't really respond as far as, yes, I'm going to come out.
At one point in time, I went to a side phone, to a side house over here, and made a phone call to try and talk, see if I could get George on the phone to try and talk with him at that point in time. But weren't able to do anything with that.
At 9 a.m., Banks's mother was brought to Monroe Street.
Then we had his mother from back into the crowd up over into this area to be able to get in the way that she could talk to George.
Not even his own mother talking over the bullhorn could get him to come out of the house.
Almost 2 hours into the siege, and the police were beginning to run out of ideas for how to get Banks out alive.
Many spree killers take their own lives. First, they get even, and then they commit suicide. But George Banks' standoff with law enforcement may have been intended to give him what he couldn't do himself. He wouldn't drop his weapon. He'd go out in a blaze of glory. He'd let the police do what he couldn't do, and that is to take his life.
He kept threatening to kill himself because of killing his kids, and we kept trying to convince him that they were alive and to keep him talking.
In a desperate attempt to end the situation, it was decided to once again play up to Banks's apparent concern and confusion over the well-being of the children he'd just shot. Pat Ward, a young presenter for local radio WILK, remembers receiving a call during his daily broadcast.
Then the telephone rang, and our reporter in the field, Bob Leidig, asked me to do something on behalf of the Luzerne County District Attorney, Robert Gillespie. He asked me if we would modify our broadcast to indicate that George Banks, in fact, had killed no one.
We came up with the idea of trying to say, well, let's do a radio broadcast. Let's see if we can get somebody to do it. And Bob Gillespie, who was district attorney, arranged to have the broadcast done and to actually do an interview.
My first reaction was, is he crazy? My second reaction is, we've got to do this. There are lives at stake here.
While Bob was setting up in the interview, I had a big boombox at that point in time, and I would be within distance that George could hear the interview and hear this live interview that his children were in area hospitals, that they were being taken care of, didn't know the condition of them, but they were alive and in hospitals.
At 9:58 a.m., the fake news interview was broadcast live across the county.
The children are alive. They are hospitalized.
And George Banks was listening. The 25th of September 1982, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Having shot 13 people dead in a ruthless spree, ex-prison guard George Emil Banks had barricaded himself into the upstairs of a 2-story house on Monroe Street. Below, a circus-like crowd of press and public watched on, as police tried everything in their power to draw him out safely. At 9:58 a.m., in a last-ditch attempt, a fake radio news broadcast was played out over a speaker, stating that the children Banks had just shot were in fact alive and needed his help.
The children are alive. They are hospitalized.
But to their dismay, Banks remained defiant.
Although he listened, we didn't know what was really going through his head. We could only hope to surmise or try to hope that he had some belief in what was happening. He kept saying, I know I killed them.
But at the same time, I think a part of him wanted to believe that the children were alive.
The radio broadcast appeared to have failed, and police knew they needed to end the standoff before more innocent lives were lost.
Remember George yelled out, "It's a good day to die."
I heard policemen yell, "We have him in our sights." And I'm thinking, are they going to kill him?
But the police were not about to oblige this killer with a quick exit.
My instructions were, do not kill this person. Let the justice system do its job.
The police feared that they had run out of options to end the standoff peacefully, until to their surprise, a former prison work colleague of Banks pushed forward from the crowd.
His name was Robert Brunson, and he knew George well from the prison, and he volunteered to talk with George.
And he said, "George, you need to come out. I won't let them hurt you. I'll put myself as a shield between you and the law enforcement officers, but you need to come out." For whatever reason, none of the other tactics worked, but this one did.
George agreed to give up, and he was going to come down the steps and out of the back of the house and meet Brunson at that point in time and hand his gun to the people outside of the house.
At 11:17 a.m., 4 hours after the standoff had begun, George Emil Banks finally gave himself up.
At the time he was coming out, he didn't have any expression. There was no sign of any expression to anything. He just looked straight forward, said nothing, and just got him cuffed, got him to the car, and got him out of here.
Almost 10 hours after beginning his merciless killing spree, George Banks was in custody.
As we went upstairs to the detective's room, we sat George on a chair, and I remember handcuffing him to the chair. And I walked out in the hallway, and I started to quiver. The adrenaline had gone. I became extremely emotional, and I just thought, wow.
The 6th of June, 1983, Luzerne County Courthouse, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Banks stood trial for the murder of 13 people. The youngest was just under 2 years old.
I can tell you the first time I met him was at the county prison, and he was in the library. He was not shackled. There was no guards, and it was just me and him. He could have came across that table on a moment's notice and killed me if he wanted to. He didn't do that. He was very respectful. He was thankful.
I can tell you from the first day I saw him to the last day I saw him, he was always alert, calm, very considerate. He sat, he looked, he listened, and when he wanted, he spoke.
At some points, as George is talking about the crimes, at some points he would cry. At other points he would become solemn. It was just this mixture of emotions that he would display.
He believed that his children were going to die from some type of a racial onslaught, and he killed them to protect them from that onslaught.
The turning point in the trial came when Banks took to the stand. Against all advice, he revealed shocking images to the jury from each of the crime scenes.
Before the trial began, I told the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that I would not allow them to admit any of the pictures because I felt that they were so inflammatory that they might be held against Mr. Banks.
Those photographs were overwhelming. Anybody looking at those photographs, I mean, you would want to kill the person immediately who did that. The jurors, I think, were just aghast. Some of them, you could see they were starting to cry. When George put those pictures into evidence, that pretty much sealed his own fate.
On Banks's 41st birthday, and only 16 days after the trial had begun, the jury unanimously agreed to a verdict.
He was given the death penalty on 12 first-degree murder convictions. He was found guilty and he was sentenced for third-degree murder. He was found guilty and he was sentenced for, I think it might have been attempted murder, aggravated assault, theft, and robbery.
I remember I was sitting there in the courtroom crying, and he got off the stand, and he just walked over to me and just put his hand on my shoulder and then just sat down.
As Wilkes-Barre struggled to recover from the devastating spree, one question remained. What could have driven a man to commit such chilling crimes?
When an individual such as Banks, who is paranoid, and that chronic behaviour of alcohol and drug misuse can bring out the darker side of an individual, in his case, it made him quite unpredictable and prone to rages, and I think it unleashed the acknowledgement within him that his family were now a burden, and he couldn't find another way out.
The thing that stands out to me more than anything is how fragile the human brain is. In the different homicides of the many I've seen over the years, what sets off people?
I just couldn't imagine how anyone could do that. And going in and looking at my children sleeping peacefully, and to this day, it bothers me.
I do not believe that Wilkes-Barre will ever forget that day. More importantly, I don't believe that Wilkes-Barre should ever forget what happened that day.
I'm not the same as I was 30 years ago, that's for sure. But it changed my life, there's not a doubt. It definitely changed my life.
What I wanted to accomplish in the sentence, I think I've accomplished. George Banks is going to die in jail of natural causes, or he's going to die in the being executed, and he'll never, never walk the street again as a free man.